This is Michael Matheson Miller, and you are listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. Thank you for listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. I'm delighted to have as my guest today Dr. Catherine Pakaluk, and I'll give you her bio in a second. We're going to talk about her book, Hannah's Children, The Women Quietly Defying the Birthrates. So thank you again for listening. Thanks to all those who have written reviews. If you like the podcast, please do write a review on Apple Podcast. It does help grow the podcast. And thanks to those who have supported me on Patreon. I appreciate the support. And as always, the show notes for this and all episodes are on themoralimagination.com. And there you can also subscribe for my occasional newsletter, also at themoralimagination.com. So my guest today is Professor Catherine Pakaluk. She is an associate professor in the Bush School of Business at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. She earned her doctorate in economics at Harvard University. She's a recipient of the Acton Institute's Novak Award and the Heritage Foundation's Freedom and Opportunity Academic Prize. The mother of 8 children, she lives in Hyattsville, Maryland, with her husband, Dr. Michael Pakaluk, who's also a professor at Catholic U, a philosopher. So I'm really delighted to have Catherine on the show today to talk about her book, Hannah's Children, The Women Quietly Defying the Birthrates. So Catherine, thanks so much for joining the Moral Imagination.
You are welcome. It's great to be here.
Great. So let's begin. Why don't we begin with the big picture of this book? Mm-hmm. It's a very interesting book. I liked it a lot. And as I told you, when I started, I'm like, well, what's going to happen with this book, right? It's kind of an interesting concept. And it's really great because it's a mixture of stories, lots of interviews, and social science, economics, social analysis, and it's weaved in together in such a great, interesting way. Why don't you talk maybe just the big picture of the book, and you talk about like you were motivated by a single intuition, you said on page 41. If a phenomena is sufficiently consequential, then its absence must also be consequential. Sounds like an economist, doesn't it?
Yeah.
All right. Vaccination for smallpox. How did you discover? Like, what's the opposite? Why don't you talk a little bit about the big picture and your motivation?
Yeah, I will. So actually, I sound like an economist there, the absence of a phenomenon or whatever. I mean, you just like X and not X or something like that. And that's all true. We could write a little model and it'd be fun. But actually, then I talk about smallpox vaccination, and I'm kind of like a little bit of a medical history buff. And I worked for a while when I was at NIH in viral epidemiology. And actually, the best examples of this, I think, that make it most intuitive are the ones we pull from public health. And so for like a more recent example, people are thinking a lot about COVID, and I would say like early on when people were still trying to figure out what was going on. And what I'm about to say, you don't have to be on a side of COVID to think about this. But early on, something people noticed was like, hey, who's not dying? So if people are dying, like who's not dying? Oh, well, like really young people aren't dying. Or we learned pretty early on, like people with high or normal to high levels of vitamin D seemed to not get severe COVID disease. So like those types of observations are really important, right? Like who's not getting sick? Then you learn something about kind of like, so I thought, well, this is like almost like an inoculation principle or something like that. So yeah, so that's the big picture. The big picture is like the whole world isn't having enough babies. We could dig into that and like put some numbers on that. How bad is that? Is it really true? That sort of thing. And basically, if you look at the numbers, it looks like it's a free fall. And I don't know, 20 years ago, people saw it, but they didn't think it was going to keep going down. We kind of figured like, oh, we've bottomed out now, haven't we? Lately, we know that we haven't bottomed out. And even now, we haven't bottomed out. It looks like the numbers are going to keep going down. So I thought, well, I don't know. I know some people that are still having kids. So this was the non-economist part of me thought, well, there are people doing this. But the real question from the research perspective is like, does it matter? Does it matter that there's a few oddballs out there who don't look like the trend? And that is the question, right? Suppose you discovered that like people with, red birthmarks didn't get severe COVID disease. Like, what would you do with that? Well, you can't give people red birthmarks, right? So it wouldn't be relevant, right? You'd come in and be like, I found a thing, like red birthmarks are protective. Like, great. Okay, it's not a treatment. It's like not a treatment. It will not help. So that is really like the picture are the people still having kids in spite of the fact that the whole world is not having children at this point? Are they like red birthmark people? Who are they? Like religious nuts people? It's not a treatment. It's not something that matters. It's not something we should think about because they're just outliers. They're weird. Who knows? And that was the question. What are they like? And so I had a hunch that they're not like birthmark people, that maybe there's something, they're more like vitamin D people, right? They're people that maybe they're doing something or they have something that maybe would be useful. And that was the question. Yeah.
So that, to summarize this correct, that right now we have a real problem with population decline, which we'll talk about, with the not enough babies. This is not just in the United States, but all over Europe. And in fact, lots of the world is dealing with this problem. That's very shocking to people. I think people have been just kind of inundated with the idea that there are too many people in the world. So I'm going to talk about why in a minute. But so that this idea, there's this deep falling birth rates. This is a real problem. And it's going to create a lot of social problems and economic problems. Well, what's going on? Because there are some outliers who are having lots of children. And let's find out who they are and why that's happening. And is that something that's going to help us understand questions about fertility and replacement? And I guess maybe the other thing that's in the background, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you have a lot of people trying to think about family policy. Like Australia, as you know, is giving $6,000 for a baby. Hungary is talking about family policy. A lot of people are worried that we're not having children, and family policies don't seem to work. Right. So, absolutely. I mean, that's a lot. But so is that kind of the big picture? You're like, we actually have a real problem, and we'll talk about why that's a problem. And that these people that you studied are, in a sense, the outliers. And it's not as you said, a red birthmark, but it's more like a vitamin D. There's something we can learn from them. Am I getting that right? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the research question was, which kind is it? Right. What I feel like I learned and what I wanted to write about was kind of like, well, I think this is relevant. I think, in fact, what they're saying and the reasons that got people to be these outliers, like, why did they start doing this? You know, all those things turn out to be, I think, pretty relevant. I try to make the case that it's relevant. Yeah. And I mean, that's the conversation I'm hoping we can kick off. I mean, not just you and me personally today, but like this month and going forward, because I actually think it's actually good news. I think a lot of what's in here is good news, in spite of the dire birth rate thing in the background.
So maybe let's begin. I want to go to the good news and I want to talk about these things, but I think there's going to be listeners who are going to say, oh yeah, I'm following you. I got it. There might be some listeners who think they haven't thought about demographics. And if, again, like I said before, if you just watch regular news, I mean, it's like the idea that there aren't enough children is, you hear it a little bit. Can you talk about actually what the social science is on this and what the problems are? Like many people say, well, aren't fewer children better for the environment? I think it'd be good to maybe set out the problem for maybe those listeners who aren't really paying attention to demography.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll have to use a couple of numbers, but basically, might be a good starting place to think about let's think about the past. That might be useful. And I'll just speak to US data because I know this data better. But if you go back to about year 1800 in the United States, the typical woman would have had about 7 or 8 children. And so we use the number of total fertility rates. Just her completed lifetime fertility was about 7 or 8 kids. If you fast forward to 1900, that number is about 4. So over the 1800s, that number cut in half. And then if you fast forward to 2000, that number cut in half again to about 2. So the typical woman about 20 years ago would have had about 2 births in her lifetime. And so that's the big picture. So we say 2 births per woman, if she's coupled up, right? We think about that as about the number of children you have to replace a population. If you live in a village or country, if everybody has 2 births, every woman has 2 births. That's more or less what demographers say keeps your population exactly at 0. 0 growth, 0 contraction. Basically, because the population grows, if you're 3 or 4 kids per woman, the population is growing, you're adding. So you have more people, but if they have a smaller number of births per person, over time, you're still going to have growing populations. But we do understand that at a certain point, if women have fewer than 2 children, whole populations can start to decline or shrink, right? So countries can shrink and the globe could eventually shrink in terms of the number of people. So here's the way this stands. In the year, around 1960, the world hit 4 billion. And today we've just passed the 8 billion mark. But that number will certainly peak very soon in the next couple of decades, and people keep adjusting this. But what we understand is that already since 1970s, depending on where you were, women weren't having replacement levels of births. And so you can see what that looks like is, well, already in the 1970s, people don't have 2 births on average, but the population still burgeons, right? From 5 billion to 8 billion. That's because it's just growing. It's these dynamics. But what happens if you do that for enough decades? Well, you will start to hit a peak, and we could talk about this as a problem. And then you'll start to hit contraction. So where are we now? We're now in the place where whole countries are contracting. And I don't just mean they're hitting below replacement fertility. I mean, there's just fewer people today than last year. More people dying than being born, basically. So China did this, or at least officially, we think China is reporting contracting. The first report of that was in 2022. So we learned about it in 2023. Japan's been contracting for more than 10 years. And lots of European countries are about to start contracting. And that's where we are today, right? One other thing that you mentioned was kind of like, is this just like Asia and, like the European West? No, in fact, like countries like Mexico, when I was born in the 1970s, Mexican total fertility rates looked like what ours looked like in 1800s. But today they look very, very similar to the United States. So it took Mexico about, 30 to 40 years to do the demographic transition that the United States did in 200 years. And that kind of convergence is true everywhere. So basically what I like to say is that convergence to kind of Western low fertility rates is an iron fact of modern demography. So people, I don't think they're not everywhere, but there are a lot of folks who are kind of counting on the idea that there'll be people from other countries will just make up the deficit. But that won't be true because, in fact, almost everybody is reaching this place. Only a handful of countries that have birth rates above 4 at this point, just a handful. And those are shrinking.
So two things, and I want to get to I want to make sure because you like. So,
I maybe didn't do.
No, that was very good. No,
okay,
that's good.
It's too much.
No, I'm actually thinking like, so just for some of the listeners who are like, oh, wait, is this going to be all demography? No. You're going to hear stories about lots of super interesting women. We're going to talk about education. We're going to talk about just what it's like to have a lot of children, the challenges with religion. Right. Yeah, there's a lot of social sciences.
I don't scare anybody off with them.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's helpful a little bit to just get this picture out, because in one sense, people would say, well, okay, is it that big of a deal? I mean, aren't we told consistently that we have too many people? Isn't it good to have contraction? What's wrong with contraction?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can say what we know is wrong, or at least what we know is bad. I will say bad and wrong. Maybe that's the same thing, but I'll say it this way. I mean, there's kind of like at least two levels that we could think about. I mean, one is sort of just the economic, or we could say political economic perspective, right? Countries, we could talk about like national identity. Countries that are shrinking will have to face a kind of tough choice where they either fill in the blanks, so to speak, for their economy with immigrants. And we know we're in a time where it's like fraught with this question about immigration. In a sense, like, are people just exchangeable? Well, cultures aren't exchangeable. And so there's a kind of national or existential identity question, right? So if you shrink, people like to say, well, there won't be Japan anymore. I think Elon Musk just tweeted that there won't be Japan anymore. And like, there won't be Japan. And would that be a sad thing for the future, that Japanese culture and tradition would just be performatively by people who move there and learn Japanese ways? I mean, that's a deep question, right? So I said I wasn't sure if it was wrong, but it feels bad. I mean, it feels bad to me that we would lose Japan, that we would lose Spain, we would lose Portugal, or we're going to lose Italy. I mean, that feels like a bad thing to me. So that's the first point, just cultural disappearance or cultural.
To lose Italy would be a disaster.
Wouldn't that be terrible?
Food across the world.
Right. Just like be terrible. Right. I know. So that's the first one, is this kind of national identity. And I mean, just in more like crass terms, I would say like economic growth. We can't have economic growth with a shrinking population. And that translates into a lot of problems. I mean, first of all, nobody likes the thought of kind of a future of, we'll say, secular stagnation or economic stagnation, low growth rates, if at all, probably contracting growth rates. What does that mean to have economic contraction? It means like the things we associate with a recession or even a depression without the levels of unemployment, right? So like there wouldn't be enough people to do the jobs, but other than that, we'd have this low growth rate because essentially like businesses would have to close. It's this thing. We don't have lots of examples of this because it's never happened before, but that's what we would forecast. And that won't be good because that's bad. We don't like that. I mean, it sounds bad to me, but worse than that, right, is that if you sort of think it's a good thing to have like what we would call Western style, like welfare states and have lots of benefits and have the governments do lots of things, everything that you pay for with your economy, you can't have. So those things all have to scale back. So we talk about entitlement programs becoming bankrupts and Social Security and things like that. So if you care about those things, that would be sad. And the last thing that I think it's good to mention is that increasingly smaller family sizes, people born into families of 1 or 1.5 children, whatever that looks like. We're talking about having fewer siblings, fewer cousins, fewer aunts and uncles, just smaller networks of people who know you and love you. And that has to translate into, greater levels of disconnectedness and isolation and not feeling rooted. And the types of things we tend to associate with, like, kind of our modern malaise, right? Kind of individualism and just a sense that I'm an island, I'm all by myself. Maybe you are actually an island. You are all by yourself. Like, you're the only child of your parents and you have no cousins and you have no aunts and uncles. And it is just you. Like, what else teaches you from a young age that we're in community besides being in a community, right? So I wouldn't want to ignore this piece. I think that would be a tremendous loss.
And would you say, by the way, that's a problem already?
Yeah.
I mean, aren't we seeing that already? I mean, in Europe for sure, but increasingly in the United States. Mary Eberstadt's written about this. Yep. There's all this Silicon Valley. I think they just said loneliness is one of the, it's like a public health problem, right? So, I mean, this is already happening, isn't it?
It is already happening. Yeah. And I didn't go into this project looking for this sort of data or these sorts of testimonies, but these kind of just jumped out at me in a really shocking way. And I thought, well, we'd have to account the loss of human connection as part of the problems with these declining birth rates.
Okay. So that's, I think, the big picture of or at least the background, maybe.
Yeah.
And you do talk about some of the economics there. You talk about, I think, the pension thing you mentioned quickly, but I think it's important. And you say on page 31, you say, if tomorrow's pension, right, there's your Social Security and all these things in the Western nations, is funded by today's children. When births go down, funds available to pay for the pension will also go down. And tax and transfer pension programs that make the economic benefits of childbearing, and it pushes them into the futures. Okay. But the costs of childbearing remain private and immediate. And so what you have is this, in a sense, these multiple things, but one of them is, well, I don't have to worry about children. The state will take care of me. But if there's no children, the state won't take care of you, or that is somebody else's children will take care of you.
Right. The state is just other people's kids in the next generation. So it's kind of an intergenerational free rider problem, right, that you could see happening.
And that seems to cause other just social problems too. I mean, it sounds far off, but I mean, it is it does seem like that's going to create anger, resentment, etc. What do you think? I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I see it in my students already. You tell them, okay, this thing that a huge part of your taxes are right now they get their paychecks. They go, what is this thing? What's withheld? They go, and you go, well, it's this thing you won't have. You won't get it. It won't probably exist when you grow up. And I think it will. I mean, we don't have to dig in here to the sort of the fiscal problem of the modern state, but that's looming and huge. I mean, the size of the debts that are there, the Social Security transfer payments are just part of that problem. Yeah. Good.
Okay. Well, that's good. That's good background, because I just think it's important. In some ways, it's the dry stuff, right, of the book, because
it is the dry stuff. I know.
But it's a background, because I think mean, I always looming in this question is Greta Thunberg, or I'm not sure you say her last name, who's we got to stop population,
right?
And it's kind of a sentimental idea, but the reality is, if you don't have population, they're not going to just be the same with a couple of, fewer people around.
Right. That's right. I mean, you asked about the problems. Of course, I can't authoritatively weigh in on sort of how many people the planet can handle and that whole question. But I would say a pretty sober read of the climate complaint about children. I think a pretty sober read would say we know a lot less than we think we know about it. But yeah, for sure. No, I mean, it's not a future that looks good as you start to shrink down.
Okay. So in that context, then you decided to go do something kind of interesting, as you decide to say, well, not everybody's having fewer children.
Right.
And who's not having fewer children? And I'm going to go talk to them. And you decided you were going to look at families with 5 or more children, right? And this was a little bit of a surprise to me. If a woman with 5 children is in the top 5% of childbearing women, that means 95% of women have fewer children than that. And then for 7 children, you're in the top 1%. So I told my wife, look, your husband may work at a nonprofit, but you're still in the 1%. Unfortunately, it's not the economic 1%, but she is in the 1% because we have 7 children. And you're in what, the 0.6% because you have 8 children.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it sounds like it's this tiny, originally I wanted to call that chapter the 1%, right? Because like it's this other 1%, but it turns out it's like more than that. It's 5%. 5% isn't nothing, actually. It sounds like a small number, but it turns out to be at least in my cohorts, like 500,000 women. So that's not nothing.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And then there's like, the cohort right behind me, the one that's like 40 to 45 is another 500,000 women. So yeah, there's a lot of us. So I mean, we're not talking about like a fraction of 1%. I mean, 5% is pretty decent number. Now you can ask me why 5? Why did I pick 5? Like I could have picked anything above 1.6 in a sense to talk about people who are out. But obviously, like I had limited resources. Why did I pick 5? I wanted to get people who are really doing something different because I want to describe something different. So, I think there's a lot of people who are trying to do something different who life circumstances or whatever else doesn't get them up to 5. That's fine. Lots of people like that. But this definitely served its purpose. Like I found people doing really different things. And that's what I wanted to bring to the table.
Good. Why don't you talk about that? Maybe kind of go through some of the big picture there on that. And I think, by the way, you make an important point. Like it's not the case that people with 3 children or 2 children aren't also doing something different. At 5 and above, it's almost like now you have to be doing something different, right? It's like it's much more obvious of what's done. But why don't you talk about this? And you can go in, many directions, but I mean, you start and say part of this is social analysis. Part of it is a critique of social sciences. Part of it is and how to think about religion and social sciences. But maybe talk about the study you did a little bit and all the women you interviewed.
Yeah, right. The decision to grab the 5% and more was really it was a research decision based on our resources. I don't have a huge research budget. So I thought, how could I get the most bang for my buck out of this group? So what you really want to do is go after kind of people who make it clear, and you're going to find this because that's what they're doing. Women getting more education and doing more things is not necessarily a reason to put kids last in your life. And that's the shape of the modern problem. The modern problem is the more wealth we have, the more education women have, the fewer children we see cross country and, in every place that we look. So I picked about 10 different regions in the country. We tried to be geographically diverse and, tried through the normal ways that you do for this kind of sociological research, tried to find a reasonably diverse sample of people. We went to churches, we went to homeschooling groups, we sent around these flyers and invited people to participate in the long interviews. We got a whole bunch of applicants from every area and then sort of selected the few based on trying to get a kind of balanced sample. And then we went around and we interviewed everybody. And then I spent 3 years struggling with 100 hours of transcript testimony. So, you said, of course I can move into like specific findings and that kind of thing. There's a lot of things to touch on because it's not one thing, but maybe it'd be useful to sort of restate the premise or this insight and kind of restate it in another format, which is something like this. So social science, I'm an economist, but this work we'll say it's kind of qualitative. It's a little bit more sociological. We really like to study dysfunction. We really do that well, right? And I think it's human. Right? Like we like the true crime stories, right? With like your podcast would be a lot bigger probably if you did some true crime in the middle.
I need to start doing that.
Right?
Yeah.
We really like dysfunction and we like to oogle at disasters. And this is like just not something we're ever going to avoid, right? Like the gruesome stuff is just kind of more exciting. But how do you paint a picture of what kind of sustainability looks like or what function looks like? I'm using sustainability because there's something true about that, right? Like divorce as a norm in a society isn't sustainable. We could say that even though we know that there's sustainability gets used in a wacky way. And what we mean is sort of like divorce as a norm creates all this pain and angst and anxiety in people that makes it difficult for them to avoid divorce themselves, right? So it's not a sustainable thing. With the childbearing, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at something that's not even replacing itself, right? It's like we didn't shift to this like 2.5 child thing and then we just stayed there. It's like we went from 2.5 to 1.5. And listen, South Korea has like a 0.5 right now. So like how low can we go? We don't know. So what does it look like to not do that? So this is what I mean. So I thought, I felt convinced that if I talked to enough people, I might be able to paint a portrait of this, what I think of as like a sustainable thing, right? Or maybe put it differently, like a picture of health. So that was the goal. And maybe in another way to restate that, sort of, we're in a moment right now. There's we talked about this a little bit, but we're in a moment right now a lot of people are questioning a lot of things that they took for granted. Are we feminists anymore? We don't know. Are we liberals anymore? We don't know. Are we for democracy anymore? I mean, a lot of people don't know. I mean, these are all interesting questions. Like, what do we do with all these things? And there's, in some sense, like we're in this moment where for conservatives, we'll say all the orthodoxies that we might have grown up with are kind of on the table and ready to be re-interrogated, right? And in that zone, I thought, well, what are we for? We all know what we're against here. We all know what all the things are that are broken. What are we for? And that was another way to sort of describe what I was after. I know about me. I know about the kids I have. You probably know about the kids you have. And I thought, well, are there common ways of talking about this life? Are there common things that get you started in this life? Are there common things that get you going? Or keep you going? Yeah, that was what I was after. And so, yeah, of course, now I'm teasing your listeners. I mean, there are all these common things. And so what are those things? So that was the job. But I didn't feel, after all of these interviews and hundreds of hours of transcripts, I didn't feel that I could do better than, in a sense, providing the stories. That these are not principles that can be presented in a disembodied way, like outside of people's stories, right? Because it's not true that, like, in order to prioritize family and children, you have to never work. That's not true. Some women I talk to work and some of them don't. And it's not true that you have to practice your faith in this way or that way, because I've got all kinds of varieties of that. So it was, when you're facing that sort of thing, you're like, the best thing I can do is present testimony here and then leave my readers to sort of see what might be more interesting or less interesting.
Yeah, it's really, like I said, I wasn't sure how it was going to come.
Where's this going to go? Yeah.
We have so many quotes throughout the whole thing, and just the recorded testimonies, and you get to know these different women and their different personalities. And it's kind of funny. You get a kind of a kick out of them because you can sometimes just see the personality. I got a kick out of the Japanese lady, Miki. Yeah. And I lived in Japan 5 years. And so she says, well, I'm in graduate school, and like my husband, and this was one of the funny ones, like my husband was a Catholic, but he's kind of a fallen away Catholic. Right. And so the Catholic Church, right, teaches that contraception is forbidden. Right. But most Catholics contracept. Right. And here was a guy who was not a practicing Catholic, but he's like, it doesn't sound right to me. You shouldn't contracept, because he's from 1 to 7. It was just kind of like this like weird.
The one thing he hung on to.
Yeah. The one, like, is one thing you hung on to. He hung on to the one thing that most people don't hang on to. Right. Yep. And then he met this lady, and she's not raised in any religion. Yep. You know, it's kind of like, and she said, so I'm in graduate school and we're dating, and all of a sudden we're talking about marriage. And he's like, well, are we going to have children? And I'm like, what? Yeah. He's like, I think we need more children. So, well, I'll have 1 or 2. And this was funny. So then you talked about how she converted. And I kind of got a kick out of this because, again, I lived in Japan for many years. And she said, well, Japanese are superstitious. So I'm like, okay, you know, we can deal with some religion stuff. And then like the Pope, like, yeah, we like authority. I mean, Jesus is harder for me to understand than the Pope. Right. I mean, just so funny. Like these this couple, like he's a Catholic who doesn't practice, but obeys contraception. And she's like, I can deal with the Pope. It's Jesus I have a problem with. I mean, it's just funny. And then, but how they talk about it. And these are like highly educated. She's a professor and talking about this whole like, you know, element of conversion. But what was very interesting here that struck me, and this came as a common theme, is she describes, and then you do as well. She said, okay, I'll have 1 or 2. And then she came to a point where she said, okay, I'm open to 3. And your comment, I have to maybe find the page number, so I'm kind of doing it off memory, but your comment was, it was striking because here you had this woman, her own unique experience, speaking very similarly to other women with very experiences. Right. And the idea of shifting to, I am open to having children. Yeah. And so children, in one sense, and maybe this is we can go on a couple pathways, but children were no longer like a choice or a thing. Yeah. They weren't a commodity or they were a blessing or an opportunity or ever. Maybe did I set them? Could you talk about that? Yeah, that was for sure. That stood out to me pretty.
So I spent, as you could see, I spent a lot of time in those first few chapters trying to outline what was common about. So one of the things, like you'll see the title of the book, of course, it's a mouthful. I get that it's a bad title. Hopefully I can convince people to read it even though there's a bad title. Now, when I'm joking a little bit, it's a bad title. It's a great title, if you know what I mean. It's a great title once you understand what I'm getting at. Publishers hate those kind of titles, or like mystery titles. But the reason I'm answering your question, the reason this is titled Hannah's Children is because I needed to find a way to talk about what it meant to be open to children as a blessing and not as sort of an acquisition, not a thing that you acquire, that you fit into a kind of customized plan of life. And I really struggled with that because there's no like phrase, I didn't discover one that just kind of gets that job done. Because the common feature wasn't people went out to like pick 12 kids off the shelf or 5 kids off the shelf. The common feature was at some point from people, it was different how that happened, becoming kind of open to the possibility that God might want to bless them in this way. Super, super different. And so, you might read things like you read things a lot about like, oh, it looks like women aren't having as many children as they say that they want to have. You do read that. There's something to be said for that. I even talk about that briefly in the book. I worry that we make a little bit too much of that because when you just sort of survey people about what they want in the abstract, they want all kinds of things that they may not be prepared to make sacrifices for. And so how much do they want it is a much more interesting question. It turns out that the women in my book really did want children a lot in the sense that they were prepared to make sacrifices for them. But that was a different kind of wanting. It's a wanting that reflects like wanting to be open to this kind of the action of providence in your life, that sort of a mystery. And so, right. So obviously right at the front, that smacks you in the face with this thing where like, okay, so the tools of the social scientist to kind of survey you and ask you what you want are obviously going to be insufficient to describe this different way of life. This is why I appeal to the biblical Hannah, because I thought like, who's the most iconic figure in the history of the Western tradition who really wants a child? But I thought like the biblical Hannah is the most.
Do you want to just tell the story for listeners?
Yeah,
most probably know, but.
Yeah, so the biblical Hannah, she was the second wife and the most favorite wife of a man in the Old Testament. She's the favorite, but she's sort of less socially excellent because she doesn't end up having any kids. So she's barren. So the biblical Hannah is barren and she feels this shame because she's barren. This is a culture that sees children as a blessing and wealth and some things as status, right? So she prays desperately for a child. She goes night and day to the temple, we're told, and she's praying constantly for a child. And so finally, Eli, the priest who's there, he kind of looks at her and just thinks like, this woman she's really at it. So he talks to God and, basically says, we know we should do something for her. So they bless her with Samuel, right? So God and Eli intervened and she receives Samuel. And now Samuel, of course, has a great role to play in the history of the Jewish people. He ends up anointing King David, and this is very important. She doesn't know this at the time, so she's just praying to have a child. So she gets Samuel. She says at one point when she's praying, if you give me a child, I will give this child back to you. Like I will bring the child as a young boy to be in the service of the priests at the temple. And as a mother, you read this and you think like, really? Are you sure you want to make that promise? I mean, that's kind of tough. Like you are praying for the one child. Well, anyway, she does this. She gets this child. She names him Samuel. She raises him up. And after 2 or 3 years, she brings him back to the temple and basically drops him off. And you're dying. I mean, you're reading this, you're thinking, oh, wow, that is tough. It's really beautiful. We're told that she brings like little clothing for him and stuff, and she leaves him there. But what's amazing, and I didn't remember when I was engaging this idea, like the idea that Hannah was the right person to think about, is that after she brings him back, Eli says to God, that is faith. That is amazing faith. She brings her most precious possession back. And then what happens? He says, we need to reward her. So she has 5 more kids. God sends her 5 more kids. Anyway, I thought that was a remarkable thing. So that's the story of Hannah, and that's Hannah's children is ultimately refers to that. Now, the first woman you meet in the book, I call Hannah as well. These are all pseudonyms, but I call her Hannah. She has 7 children. She's a similar story in the sense that she was barren as a young woman, not because she tried to have kids. She didn't want children till she has this big conversion. So I work with the theme of Hannah throughout the book. And to me, that was a discovery. It's not something I intended to do with this material, but it's been fruitful, which is why, like I'll say, ultimately, I think it's a great title. And I think it's worth talking about who the biblical Hannah is.
Something, can I just, something I should,
yeah, please.
Oh, sorry.
No, please.
No, something I should have said at the beginning. I mean, maybe I should just edit this and put this at the beginning, but I probably won't. I should have said this at the beginning because I have your book here and like the chapters are great, right? So your part 1 is the meaning of everything, Hannah's children. And you tell a story about you on the train. You're like, is this your first? Like,
yeah, that's
no.
right.
Well, what you want? But anyway, I'm going to have you tell that story. But okay. I like it, like Reasons of the Heart, Red Diaper Babes. We'll talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah.
But then you have like these people have Kim, 12 kids. It's just a wonderful life.
Mm-hmm.
Miki, 5 kids. You believe it's good. Shaylee, 7 kids. Family is eternal, right? She's a Mormon lady.
Yeah.
Terry, strength and conditioning, 10 kids, right?
Yeah.
Lauren, who has 5 kids. Well, he wants 9. All right. And so and you have all these ladies weave in and their husbands and how it affects marriage. And it's just really good. But actually, why don't you tell the other story you begin with? Like, and by the way, I have a story. I remember when our 6th child was born, I had a lecture in Colorado that I had to go to. And my wife, I said, do you want to come? And she just had the little tiny baby. And it was just perfect days. And she just relaxed, and I had this talk. And then we were out, and people said, oh, that's your baby? Is that your first baby? We're like, it's our 6th. They're like, 6, And it was funny because in reading the experiences of the ladies, because we have a lot of children, like my wife will have those. And then, but also the husbands do too, right? Yeah. I mean, like your husband has a lot of children. And so you said, the 2 things that are funny is like, people are like, you tell a story here where they're like, wait, you have all those children with the same man? Well, I've had the same question, like, is that the same woman? And I said, yes. They're like, woo, everybody's like, woo. But I have to tell you this story. I wasn't planning to, but I have to tell you the story. Okay. It's perfect for this podcast. So our 7th child, okay, this is not a normal story I would tell for the podcast, but I think it totally fits this book. So our 7th child is a little boy. He's 3. And I was laughing. I have one of the sweetest lines in the book is on page 103. And Shaylee, who has 7 children. And I want to actually go into this because I think it's very important. She's talking about, am I ready? I want to talk about rationality and decision making. So I don't want to forget that. But there's this really sweet line where she goes, okay, I think I can have another. And I think it's good. We want a baby. We want a baby. She and her husband want a baby. And so she said, well, I was tired. And so God gave me an easy baby. He said, thank you for being willing to do this again. Have an easy baby. And I thought that was beautiful because there's something about like you're participating in an eternal, everlasting person. Right. I mean, this is like the religious dimension. So I want to go back to that, but I laugh because we have a 7th and he is 3 and he is a complete joy. Yeah. He is choleric. He is ready to roll. He is everything. I wouldn't trade him for $1 billion, but he is not easy. And my wife and I just started like, this boy is like ready to roll. So we were like, our 7th was not the easy one. But anyway, so we go into the pediatrician's office. This has never happened before. Okay. Guy, the nurse comes in, young African-American guy, buff. He's like, is this your first baby? We're like, no, it's number 7. He pauses, his eyes get big, and he fist bumps me.
Oh, that's amazing.
Okay. Right. So then, and my wife is thinking, he fist bumped him, not me. Right. And it's like, okay. So then the doctor comes in, who we've known for years, and he goes, number 7. And he fist bumped me.
Oh, that's too much.
And my wife was like, that is the funniest thing I have seen. She just was like there, just getting a kick out of it. She's like, usually like, how are you? How are you feeling? Number 7, they're like, yeah, okay, whatever. We're going to fist bump the man. And anyway, it was so funny. And then, but you have all those experiences of like, wait, are these all yours and all that kind of stuff, all those stories. Right. They never upset me. They just kind of make me excited. I'm like, oh yeah, all of them. Yeah. More the merrier. You know, absolutely. I
mean, you do sometimes get the really negative ones. And we heard a couple, right? I mean, I always ask the ladies, because there was a great icebreaker for the interviews. It was like, what's the weirdest thing anybody ever told you? That's how we got those stories in the book. Because I knew some of them were going to be interesting. And you're telling your story reminds me, there's a really nice piece out today, I think, on the Crisis magazine. If any of your listeners ever read that, or they can just go Google it, Crisis magazine, by a guy named Kennedy Hall. And I didn't know Kennedy before, but he talks about kind of an experience on a trip recently, being out to eat with his family. I don't remember how many kids he has, a lot. And just the weird comments you get. People say like, oh, well, I just got fixed, or like, I just had my tubes tied. Like, why do they need to tell you these things?
It's very strange, the things you hear.
You hear this. People seem like, I'm kind of like, look, I get it. My fertility choices are wide open for you to see, but I didn't ask. I don't want to know what you decided. And I respect what you decided. Don't make me comment. It's a funny thing, but I think it's nice that people explain those stories.
But I found a lot of people were more
surprisingly
often,
positive. Yeah.
yes, almost always. And now I'm a man, so maybe it's different because like I'm bald and I maybe look angry and they don't want to mess with me or something. But like almost always, more often than not, they're like,
more often than not.
And a lot of, you know what, if this happens, we're talking about kind of off your book, but I noticed this. Women who are, say, late 50s, early 60s, early 70s, boomer, like especially like 60s and 70s.
Right.
I cannot tell you how many times I hear, oh, I wish I had more children. I hear that more than anything else. I wish I had more children. Did you hear that or no? Do you hear that?
Yeah, I hear it all the time. It's a common regret. It's the kind of thing you do. You hear it a lot. Or you hear people say, oh, you did it right? And you're kind of like, oh, okay. You hear that too. Interestingly, as you know from reading most of the book, a lot of the women that I talked to who had very generously sized families, they also felt like they wished they could have had one more. Now, obviously, for most of them, they didn't have the last kid or the one they regretted not having, usually because they ran out of time or like circumstance. But it's something that takes time somehow to percolate in people, right? So it's like you have your two, you decide you're done, you 2 under 2 or something. They're just a really big handful. It's hard. You've never met anybody that has like 5. Wouldn't even occur to you. But then what happens? They grow up and actually you're like, wow, there's these 2 fine human beings that I really enjoy. And at that point, it's easy to look back and think, well, I don't know, we would have been nice to have one more, which is one of the reasons why it's good to talk about this, right? It's just like, great. But there's this kind of like, it somehow the goodness of it bears itself out over time. And you don't want to trust yourself to make a judgment about being done when you have 2 under 2. It's a bad moment. Or like on the operating table after you had a C-section and they're like, should we just snip while we're at it? Like, I'm going to be weak. Like, I just went through 9 months of pregnancy. Don't ask me today if I'm done, but these are all the kinds of things that have kind of baked themselves into the way we think about making these decisions. And it's short term, right? It's short term. In the long run, the regrets come.
Yeah. So maybe let's go. I mean, I just started, sure. I don't know. I think when all the stories of these that you read, you think of your own stories, but our favorite is the fist bump. Like my wife thinks that's awesome. Just the funniest thing. She thought it was so funny. But let's maybe talk a little bit about this concept of the desire, like the commodification issue. And like we were talking before, so listeners probably know, I really like the Italian philosopher Augusto Del Noce. And I have a podcast with Carlo Lancialotti, who's his translator. Carlo's magnificent and super insightful. Sometimes if I ever have a lecture, I call Carlo, like, what should I say? But Del Noce has this concept of what he calls pure bourgeois. And it's more complex, but the key part is, he said, we began to see in the 50s this move in resisting communism from we're going to defeat communism on Christian principles to we're going to defeat communism on productivity, liberation, sexual liberation, like technocracy, et cetera. And these, Del Noce says, are really Marxist values or materialist values. And then second, he said, we had the hippie movement. And the hippie movement, as Ratzinger writes about, had some positive elements, right? There was a rejection of kind of the industrial military complex and technology and the consumer society. Yeah. But there was also, unfortunately, a rejection of tradition, marriage, family, religion. Yeah. Now, I actually think, and this is a bit of an aside, that part of the problem with the conservative movement, Catherine, and this is maybe another topic, is that the conservative movement reacted against the hippie and so affirmed tradition, but also affirmed a certain consumerist life. Yeah. As almost like, I'm not a hippie. And it's kind of weird. But anyway, that's an aside. But I think it's actually a social problem today. Okay. Yeah. But what happened, Del Noce says, is that the hippie, after the age of Aquarius didn't arrive, the hippie became a yuppie. And she continued the rejection of tradition, but totally absorbed materialist, consumerist culture. And he said, we shifted from Christian bourgeois, where the idea of markets, exchange, et cetera, are rooted in justice and other moral order, and became pure bourgeois, where every single thing becomes an object of trade. Our sperm, our eggs, our womb, everything, persons, everything is trade. Happiness is acquired. And I wonder, when I was reading your book, you don't address Del Noce, but that idea of pure bourgeois, that everything's a kind of a trade, everything's a decision, everything's a transaction. one thing that becomes clear in almost every single woman that you talk about is there's a movement away from transactional culture to openness to life. And children are not commodities. They're not trophies. They're just unique, unrepeatable persons. And you get to get them as a gift.
Right.
I don't know if that, like, you want to comment on that, but I think, could you develop this idea? Because I think, and it goes into the question of, they're not just brainwashed women who's the thumb of their husband telling them to have more kids. It's oftentimes a woman who wants more children. It's rational. It's thoughtful. A lot of the people are highly educated, not everybody. They know the trade-offs. Can you talk about this move? And maybe you think what my point about pure bourgeois is unrelated, but that stood out to me.
Right. It would be bad, I think, if I started out by reading you another quote from the
No, please, yeah.
No, but I'm going to do that in a second, because I think there's
please.
a quote in the book that kind of gets at what you're describing. Yeah. So I think you're onto something when you talk about the way the conservative movement kind of got off the track, like by talking about consumerism. Another theory I have about the same phenomenon is, I think like there's blessings of pluralism, but one of the downsides of pluralism is that when you are faced with something that's objectively spiritual, you kind of move to like the lowest common denominator of the various traditions in front of you. And I think that we've done that. So I think about like, I don't know, like the conservative way of pushing back on legal abortion. Like that's something I think has suffered from this. The most powerful thing you can say about why fetuses in the womb shouldn't be attacked is that God is the author of life. And you can speak to meaning and purpose, but we've kind of taken this like lowest common denominator of like, it's a living human being and we shouldn't take its life. Now that isn't wrong, but it's not the most powerful argument you can make. And I've often wondered if that was part of us just thinking, well, we didn't all agree about the religious principles, but we could agree about like the fact of human existence or something. This is just I'm kind of responding to your idea that like, how did we end up focusing on consumer arguments for capitalism? Because you're absolutely right. Like the important arguments aren't consumeristic. And communism and Marxism wasn't a consumeristic materialist problem at the beginning, right? Like, so we think of Marx as being a super materialistic guy, or that's what he's interested in. But it's obviously that's not the theater of battle. That's not what's going on. So I think you're right about that. I think that absolutely it's true to say that as relates to children and this kind of rationality, that absolutely, well, I'll just say that I think it's easier to sort of spy some places where you kind of go like, what is going on here? One of them that relates to the question you raised. So I'll say one is like a thing, and we'll just leave it there. You can see how you react, and maybe let's just see what people think about it. And the other is a quote. And I think they work together, but I'm just laying them out. One is that, and I say this at the beginning of the book, we have taken for granted more or less that people would like to have kids. Like we sort of just take that for granted. So if you're sort of in the family policy world, if you are, and most people aren't, and I'm not even really, I'm not deep in it. You're in this kind of world of like, how do we make things better for families, and how do we make it easier for people to have kids? And that's what you're thinking about. The general assumption is like people want to do this because it's like normal human behavior to have kids. And so if they're not having kids, something's wrong, right? And I'm really kind of struggling with whether that's true or not. Right. So I describe this as like, what's the propensity to have children? We know that people have a propensity to mate, get married, and couple up, like whatever you want to call that. We could be crass to say like there's a very powerful sexual drive in us. And I don't think that's crass. I think it's basic and good. And we know that there's a strong propensity to do that. But if you don't have a kind of like easy contraceptive toolkit, then the very strong human propensity to find a mate will spill over into a certain amount of births. Once you have a very strong contraceptive culture, which I'm going to describe in two ways based on quotes in a second, now you actually have to ask the question, how much do people want to have kids, apart and aside from how much they want to couple up? Like, right? And that becomes an object of interest on its own, an object of analysis, an object of question. And that's another way of describing what you're describing, which is, well, when and how did children become part of a kind of consumerist way of thinking about things? And I guess what I'm saying is I'm not sure if I can answer your question, but I kind of want to put it out there for discussion that maybe when you enter this world where, we'll just say sterility is the norm. What do I mean by sterility? I mean that once you have widespread diffusion of the birth control pill, people start out marriage sterile and they end up marriage sterile. So what happens is it's a completely different universe, which people hardly ever think about. When our grandparents got married, they got married, lived together, probably had a couple of kids. And at some point, if they thought, well, we can't handle this anymore, or we're just overwhelmed, there were things you might try to do to limit your family size. And I'm not saying that was universal, but I'm thinking this is how it went. Kids came as a byproduct of an activity we expected. And then, maybe they lived apart for a while, or maybe they did something else. There certainly were things you could try in the old days. That's all fine. What we don't know is now what happens is you get married and you're on the pill, most people, and you're just sterile and you wait around until the right time to have a child. And that right there, I think you're almost done. Now it's well, what are the right conditions to have a child? Well, how much does a kid cost? Well, actually, we don't know how much a kid costs, right? We see all these things. So now you can just engage this whole conversation about when do you choose a child? And so you're in the whole world of consumer choice at that point. So I'm just putting that out there. It's not exactly an answer to your question, but it's an observation that when you live in a world where sterility or the kind of barrenness that in the past we would have thought of as a curse, when that's the norm for the adult life cycle, then we have to make an explicit decision to let a child in. We have to turn off the contraception to let the child in. And that's our way of life. The quote I said I was going to pull out for you, if it's not too much, it's not super long.
No, please.
One is more just a cultural description. The quote it's a kind of quote within a quote, but these demographers are quoting from this French historian of childhood. It's an amazing book, which I went and got. I think it's called The History of Childhood. It was published in 1962. It's incredible and weird. And it's weird in lots of ways. It's a great book. And Arias, not really a French scholar, but he says...
Do you know the page?
Yeah, in this book, the page is 21. This is on page 21. It's in the Red Diaper Babies chapter. So the demographers basically said the idea of the distinctness of our current time, this time of low fertility, for these demographers, the idea of its being distinct stems from this French author's analysis of the history of childhood. And skipping, he says, this guy says, look, in an earlier phase, when we saw that decline in fertility in the 1800s, this was because people really wanted to invest more in their children. They became richer and they were able to do that. But what we see today is a very different type of thing. It's really children are chosen when they're chosen as part of the self-realization of being an adult. So top of page 22, the motivation or the transition to parenthood is part of adult self-realization within the role or the lifestyle as a parent. Meaning, I'd like to have a job, I'd like to travel to Europe, I'd like to have a house, and I'd like to be a parent. Right? So it's it's one of the things you do to check the box of adulthood or being an adult or adulting, right? All of that. You don't need to have more than a child. Maybe it's a boy and a girl to be realized as a parent. That is a different kind of acquisition of children than the type of acquisition that might have been common in the time of the biblical Hannah. Children have intrinsic value and they're worth pursuing, making sacrifices for their sakes, right? Not so I'm more fulfilled, but for their sakes, right? So when I read that passage, I thought, well, that's a really interesting idea that we might see something that looks the same, like having a child, but that the choice to have a child, a certain kind of rationality, one is a type of rationality that sees children as fitting into a basket of goods, a basket of things you want. And the other, which sees children as, this other, it's not something that's chosen, but something that's received, right? Something that's received. And so you want to be able to receive. What does that mean? So that was the one part of the quote. And I think the other part, which I probably won't, it's on page 20, just right in the next chapter. So I can't see the page number. Page 19 is that more sort of graphic description. During this earlier phase, the issue is to adopt contraception in order to avoid pregnancies, when to start contracepting. You've had 3 or 4 kids. In the later part, it's just when do you stop contracepting? You start out marriage sterile. when do you switch over to the right time to have a child? And I don't know. I think that's like the philosophical shift that gets
What page
us
is that again? Sorry.
So that quote that I just read is page 19. So
that I remember. That's a strong.
It's a strong quote. When I first read it, I just kind of thought, oh wow, there's a lot to unpack, and we don't know what it means. But one potential implication, which I don't spell out exactly in the book, is like, if you're in that world where people in the adult world, people are generally permanently expected to be sterile, is that a world that can sustain above replacement birth rates? And just really briefly, just to make sure your listeners aren't going to get the wrong idea here, I didn't find in talking to the women I talked to that this was a group of women that as a rule had rejected the use of birth control. It was a group of women who'd rejected like the baggage that comes with it, or sort of the philosophy of planning in a kind of customized or consumerist way. But they did space their children in all kinds of ways. I just want to make sure that's clear because it was an important thing. This weren't people who all rejected the use of birth control. I'm just highlighting the presence of the first really effective kind of long-term birth control. So it's something that you're just on as a state, right? This is very different, even like from a barrier method or an IUD. So you're just on this thing permanently for 20 years, except when you turn it off for 2 years. That's a really profound change.
That's a huge change. Right. So I would just say, it kind of, at least obviously I have confirmation bias, but it affirms my Del Noce read, right? I like Del Noce, but and one of the language. So I give a talk for Acton University where you speak. Yeah. I give the first talk, which is on Christian vision of the person. And one of the things I say always is that, in the context of this whole talk, what does it mean to be human person, unique, unrepeatable, with reason, et cetera, right? And free will, and but I said that when you say a child is a gift, that's actually not sentimental. That's an ontological reality. That's a state. It's an ontological proclamation. Yeah, and that a child is not simply chosen because the child is unique, unrepeatable, and exists for his or her own sake, because the child is a subject, not an object. And there's for listeners who know Wojtyła's Love and Responsibility, there's a lot there, right? Right. And in what you see is, let's be clear, I don't mean that everybody who has two children, objectifies their children. I think there's wonderful people who love their children. What I'm saying is, culturally, the idea is, okay, now we're going to turn on fertility, choose to have a child, and then we'll turn it off. And that choice, though, gets connected culturally to everything from using IVF to create designer babies, to, of course, abortion, right? Because we didn't want we're not choosing the child, right? Yeah. And what's striking about the ladies that you interview are all, they come to this point when they realize it's a choice, to be sure. Yeah. I'm choosing to have another child, and it's rational. And I think, are we ready? Maybe we should wait. It gets very, thought out, and could seem almost kind of cost benefit. Yeah. Except the cost is usually really high, but the benefit is really great, right? So the cost benefit, it's we get a really high benefit for a really high cost, right? But it's not really a utilitarian analysis. It's more of an affirmation of life is more important than utilitarian comfort. And that, in a sense, and correct me if you think this is wrong, but it's in the model you just were talking about, you're looking at, and the parent quote, I think, is really powerful. Okay, what does it mean for me to self-actualize? That's it. Well, I need a job, I need a degree, I need a nice car, I need two children, et cetera, right? In the model of the ladies that you interview, it's not part of self-actualization. It's, you're now comparing incommensurable things. Yep. Okay. Right. For the record, I am not a new natural lawyer. I think things are compensable, but I'm just stating that for the 3 listeners who just might have thought that. All right. So, but what I mean is you're not dealing with okay, should I have a car or a child? Yeah. You're saying, no, these are we're not dealing with a similar cost benefit analysis. Does that make sense? Do you think that's right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think I agree with you that, and I don't know if we're exactly in the same place. I really struggled with how to frame this. So I think that the structure of human rationality always includes comparisons between courses of action. And I think we make those comparisons in a sense, like this is a better choice and this is a worse choice, right? Like I think that, so I'm kind of avoiding cost benefit here. And the point would largely be that I think the structure of human decision making is always of that nature. So it's a kind of comparison between choices. And that we make those comparisons on assessments of value. And now we're getting to that place, right? Well, can we assess values that are commensurable? Some things are incommensurable, but that we can still rank them, right? We still rank them. Like, so my husband is incommensurable, but he's worth, like, I think I can say this, less to me than God, right? Which is kind of weird, right? Like, so that's weird, but it's true. And I think we necessarily make these kinds of value judgments. We only really have to decide which one is more important than the other if they're in conflict. And meaning, like, I want like a Mercedes and I want a BMW, but I don't have to choose between them right now. It's not a meaningful choice. So I don't really know, if push came to shove, whether I would choose which one or the other. Actually, I'm not even sure I want either one of them, to be honest. It's just an example. But right, like there's something about having to be faced with things that are in conflict. Now, there's not that many things that just by nature are in conflict, but time is something that is by nature in conflict, right? Or like if I'm really successful, it's not going to be the case that all goods in life are in conflict. For most people, we're faced with kind of budgetary trade-offs and I can't have everything. So what I examined, these women talk very specifically about, well, having a child costs time. It costs lots of other things too, but it costs time. And am I willing to give up that time for the sake of a child? And so this kind of cost-benefit language works. And I think it's relevant, it's important, it's a kind of human rationality that I think is pretty basic. But it doesn't mean that they think their kids are sort of like commodity goods, I think. Is that fair? I mean,
yeah, that's very good. I don't know if I articulated it well. I mean, I was trying to what I was trying to say is it's like an attitudinal difference. And I was saying it, I was like, I don't think I'm hitting it right. Like, and maybe I still won't again this time, but that in the first example of this is what I need for self-fulfillment, it's kind of like amidst the choices.
Right.
And that you're absolutely, and that's what I was trying to say, like it's rational, you're dealing with time, you're dealing, are we ready? Can we do this?
Right.
But there's a sense of, it's like a different category.
Different scale. Yeah.
It's in a different, it's like, yep, we're going to not be able to afford this or go on vacation or get tenure or, one of the, I'm just thinking of the people, some of the examples that you give in your book, right? These are all kind of examples from your book. Like, I'm not as productive as I could be as an academic, but, and,
that's right.
But it's like, I guess, I don't know how to say it. Maybe the, oh, well is the best thing, but, oh, well, I'm dealing with a higher good. I guess so that whereas in the first example, it feels like the quote you have that this is one among goods and I want to make sure I have it because I do value a car and I do value a child. And again, we're overstating this. Like I'm going to repeat this because I'm not saying that everybody who does that doesn't value their children differently. I think they actually do when they have the children. Yeah. But I'm talking about the attitude going in versus I'm open to receiving the gift of a child is, I do think, something that seemed to be a common denominator in the ladies. Is that right? What do you think? Am I getting that wrong?
Yeah, I think so. Certainly what I spied in the testimonies was expressions of value that were on this another scale or another level. But one friend of mine reading it said, these are like, they have reasons to have children that give order to the other reasons. They're kind of special kinds of reasons, right?
Yeah, that's good.
Like, right. So I want to have a child for this reason because this child is so intrinsically valuable. It's a subject. Like this is a whole different activity. It's the kind of activity that it can bear the weight of ordering the other goods, right? So I would think like when I said, well, this was rational behavior, what I basically meant was I didn't interview anybody who said, I would pursue another child at the risk of all other goods in my life, right? Like come hell or high water, I'm having the next kid. I could kill myself. Like my children would starve. Like I hate work. This isn't what I found. I found people who really did value all those other things in lovely ways and in differing extents. But what they were doing or what they seemed to be up to was having chosen childbearing, and this looked different for each of them, as a kind of ordering type of good, a kind of good that provided order to the other things. That's the best way I could kind of put it. It's like a reason, Pascal's like reasons of the heart or something like that. It's a special kind of reason, but it's still a reason, right? It's still a reason. And it actually ended up for many people providing a lot of clarity for other things. Because I mean, my husband just said this morning after talking to a friend of his, he said, I think a lot of people just don't know what they're doing. Like they don't know why they're around. They don't know, I think that's really common. And, it's a way of saying people don't have a purpose. So like, look, you could decide, well, I want a car or I want a better basket of groceries next week. But like, you'd be an idiot to say, well, I'm going to live my life to have a better basket of groceries. Like that's the kind of motive that could provide order to all my other motives, right? That would be weird. I mean, people do it though, I suppose, maybe not for groceries, but maybe for vacations or the houses or lifestyle. The thought here is you could view children, and some people do, this is the discovery, they view children as the kind of good that tells you how to order the other things. You could say like, I'm living for this good. This is a good I can live for. And it kind of tells me how many groceries I can buy and how many vacations I can take. And that's all fine because this is the ordering good, right? It's the ordering good in the sense of it's being a purpose. Yep. And for many of them, it became a kind of identity, right? So that's all different ways of getting at it. Yeah.
No, I think that's right. I guess that's in a sense, the difference is it's not a transactional good like the other goods.
Right.
Because you're now dealing with persons who are subjects and that the husband and the wife together are in this partnership,
right?
Raising unique, unrepeatable subjects who are willed for their own sake. They don't belong to the parents. The way goods belong to you, children do not belong to you. You don't own your children.
Right.
Right. And I think that maybe that's that's like ontological shift.
Yeah.
And I think the ordering is, I like that. That helps, I think. And I guess that's the escape, I guess, maybe to bring this part to the close, we can move to other things, but maybe that's the difference between the pure bourgeois or seeing a designer baby or this kind of cultural push to see you have to have this amount of children for you to self-actualize. Which is that's the countercultural move of these women.
Yeah. And thanks for putting it that way. This is the thing I like to pick on, which is like people deriving conclusions from like these kind of isolated surveys of how many children people want. And I'm kind of like, well, what kind of wanting is that? I don't know. Like, should I take it seriously? Is it the want? I don't know. Like I'm a little skeptical about that. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's good.
And also because they change, like our desires change over time, right?
Oh yeah.
What we want changes. So, like big time.
Right. I mean, this is, I think, why you hear the 50, 60, 70-year-olds saying, I should have had more children, or I regret this,
Yeah.
I mean, it's the classic, everybody says, what's the classic line that every self-help book tells you? You never regret spending more time it's not time in the office or less time in the office. Like, I wish I had done that. So yeah, I think that's part of and I think that goes to what, your husband's point is like, people don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
There's I think this is a different issue, but I think related to maybe why people don't have children as much. You read, there was what was the article? I was trying to find it. It was in Atlantic or something by a young lady, Rachel something or other, about I'm afraid to have children. I don't want children. And it was like, I felt bad. Anyway, if I can't remember it, maybe I can just push on, but it was a big article. And I kind of felt bad, like, wow, you're really making this harder on yourself than you need to. I don't remember. Do you remember the name of that one? She was a younger lady.
This was in the last 6 months.
Yes.
Yeah. I do remember it, but not enough to recall her name.
Yeah. But the point was kind of like, I can try to find it and put it in the show notes, but I actually kind of felt for her, like she was like, wow, you have really made this into, and I don't know her past or anything. I'm not trying to judge her. I just felt like, you've made it into a much bigger kind of deal than instead of being something that's very normal and human. But I think it goes to your point. We think that it's normal to want children. And so family policy is operating this. But I did find another article at the Atlantic when I was looking for it right here. And it's called Not Wanting Kids is Entirely Normal by Jessica Valenti. Right. Now, most people would say in history of time, they would look at you in most cultures, in most places, and they'd say, what? What are you talking about? Right. Yeah. Maybe we can end up, but I think that's an important thing because that leads us into the family policy question. What if people don't want children, and why don't they want children?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm kind of, the more I think about it, the more I read about it, the more I think it's It's not obvious that people really want kids. I mean, look, you can go back in history and you can find a lot of cultures that are exposing children, exposing infants, I mean, why are they doing this? Well, it's just like they're evil, weird people. Well, I don't know. Like, children are desirable insofar as they're healthy, or insofar as they might help contribute to the army, or keeping the stock of the citizens like strong or something like that. People have sought to have smaller family burdens for a long time. I mean, you're right. I mean, it would have sounded strange to be wandering around asking people if they wanted kids or not in the past, but it's part of, like, you wouldn't have asked them if they wanted to fly to Europe either. I mean, you couldn't fly to Europe. Like, what are you talking about? Right. And maybe it's unfair. I mean, we talked a little bit about this changeover in the middle of the 60s with the birth control pill. Maybe it's unfair to say this, but when people start to say, like, well, how much, I don't know, like, the birth control pill was diffused in American society in a period of about 5 years. It was like an amazing uptake. Oh, yeah. And I don't know what to conclude from that, except to say that, like, people really want to have control over the number of children that they have. In other words, I don't know how many children people want to have or how normal it is to want children, but it seems to be very evident that if you offer people a way to have kind of like the control over how many children can enter, they grab that quickly. And I'm not saying that's bad. I'm saying that seems to be a pretty normal response. Having children is unpredictable. It has all kinds of things, right? So what's your basic response to unpredictability? Like economists will tell you, like, your basic response is to do everything to smooth your consumption, like do everything to get rid of, like, unexpectedness. So we can talk about all the reasons why people might not actually desire children or might not actually want children for their own sakes, or under what conditions people do. But I'm increasingly persuaded that we should be suspicious of the idea that kind of people just grow up wanting kids.
Yeah, that's, I think, this could maybe take us too far afield, but I think the pill is a very interesting problem because, in one sense, what you just said, well, it was available and people like, take it.
Yep.
Two, technology shapes you, right? Just like social media makes children anxious, right? And adults too. Yeah. And suburbs transform community relationships, and cars and air conditioning, all technology. Neil Postman in Technopoly, says once you could. Postman. Yes, it's a great book. Technopoly is a great book. Like, once you start writing, like, you're kind of a quack to remember stuff. Back in the day, you'd be like the wise man. And Marcia McLuhan and all this stuff. Like, I wrote a little book called Digital Contagion, just about just a little like kind of monograph about technology. But one of the things I always say is, code is not neutral. Code shapes you. Architecture shapes you. Yeah. Music shapes you. Yeah. Right. And code shapes you. And so this is this technology of the pill also shapes desires, right? I think as well. And then there's the 60s, the sexual revolution from Wilhelm Reich early in the 30s, but the sexual revolution, the idea of free love, and this is like technology and culture combined together. Yeah. So it's interesting. And the reason I bring this part up is because this goes to desire. But it also goes to, because I think you're right. Like, do people really want children? I think it also goes to in a sense, a hard problem. And that is, do you really want what you think you want? Right. And especially when you're young. Yeah, that's right. And the career is in front of you. And this is, I think, a hard problem for women, but also for men, because there's a story, one of the stories I liked in your book. What was her name? Steph, maybe? She's the volleyball player.
Oh, Terry. Yeah. Terry.
Okay. So she was from a big family. Yeah. Right. And a Catholic family. Yeah. And her father always focused on character. And it was funny. You're like, she was getting emotional. She goes, but she was 37 weeks pregnant. I mean, look, whatever. It was really human. I like the story. Yeah. But there was a story that one of the things that stood out was, it's really interesting. And it's actually something I want to talk about. So I'm going in two directions, but I want to talk about this. She said her mother stopped her when she was 8th grade. She's going to go to the Catholic prep school. And she's like, usually there were 7 other children in the car. It was just mom. And she said, she stopped. So I want to talk to you. We're sending you to the prep school and we want you to do well. But I don't want you to feel any pressure. If you just want to be a mom, like just maybe how she's right. I want to be a mom because your education is not a waste. And I'm a little worried this prep school is just a little too career oriented. So there's 2 directions I want to go in right now. And I'm going to say it just so we don't forget.
Yeah.
One is second, I want to talk about education. So I'm going to make a note to myself to talk about education and how to think about education and motherhood.
Yeah.
Because you have a lot of highly educated women, and my wife and I talk about this a lot. Okay. But let's maybe finish this track first is technology, the pill, sexual revolution. The other thing is women are more successful in school than men, right? And there's a lot of data on this now. This is like, people write about the boy crisis. And I've been interviewing a lot for this poverty film I'm directing. The problem of men and fathers and boys is a very big deal in the United States. And as economists, you know this well.
Yeah.
But in Richard Reeves in his boy crisis, talks about how boys are behind in everywhere, in every place, even Sweden, everywhere.
Right.
Girls are just way better at school. So not only are girls better at school and boys when they're younger, and boys develop more slowly, but girls are told consistently, you're smart, you can do it. The girls are good in school. You have a job, you have a career. This is your focus. This is what it is. And so children are become an obstacle to what they've been told and sold. So now you combine the pill, that is the shaping form of technology.
Right.
The idea of pure bourgeois, which we've talked about, of commodification, the sexual revolution of like separating marriage and sexuality and sexual relations and, and the sense, and then you got to be successful, you got to be successful, you got to be successful. And so the question of their wants is very interesting because almost every Hallmark movie is about the lady who went to the city and came back and realized, oh, I should have, the guy who bakes a pie. And they don't get to the children. But the point is like, what's missing is family. Family's missing. So in a question, I guess the wants thing is really hard because who's the economist in North Carolina who does stated preferences versus, who I'm talking about?
Like revealed preferences.
Revealed preferences versus stated preferences. They're not the same.
Yeah. Yes. No, they're not the same. That's right.
Anyways, that's kind of an economic social question, but do you follow what I'm saying? Like, I think that's an interesting problem. Do you want to comment on that?
I do. Yeah. So I have a story about that. So a good friend of mine who I won't name, as I don't know if she wants to be named, but she does great work. She's a sociologist. She did a study when she was in grad school in Chicago on this kind of idea of concept for young women of their ideal fertility. Like it's a simple concept. You just go around and ask young people like how many kids they think it would be right for a family to have. And part of the research was like, what do people mean when you say ideal? So in the fertility desire research, there's a kind of whole, thorny question. Do you ask like, how many kids do you want to have? How many kids do you expect to have? How many kids do you think is ideal for a family to have? And do all those things mean the same thing? So probably don't. In any case, in the process of this, she talked to a bunch of young people and was kind of trying to get at and one story, which I could dig up someplace, she was talking to a young woman and she was asking about what she saw in her future. And the young woman said, she wanted job things that she wanted to become and be successful and have a nice office and whatever it was. And then they got around to talking about kids and the woman said, well, I think 4 is a great number, like 2 of each or something. I mean, something like this. And then she kind of stopped mid-sentence, this young woman, and said to my friend, well, I don't know how that's going to fit in with what I just talked about. Like, when am I going to have time to have 4 kids? And she said something like, I'm a walking contradiction. It was like she discovered in the midst of explaining what she wanted that these two things were probably on a collision course. I mean, I kind of think that's a lot of what is happening is that, number one, like nobody's coaching young women to say like, well, look, it's possible that, the next 4 years when you're getting your graduate degree, you're going to move from a place where it's very easy to have a child to a place where it'd be very difficult to have a child. Because women's fertility is plummeting like in their 20s, like they're super fertile in their late teens, So it's already really sort of strange. Yeah. So I think that's a lot of it is like it's these desires are all in conflict and no one's really spelling out the actual conflicts and kind of how that will look. And then there's just like a desire question based on kind of knowledge, right? Like this young woman is in school. I mean, everybody's default position growing up is being in school. And that's a potential problem for this decision tree, right? Because if you're a woman and you're good at school and you take enjoyment in that, I was that kind of kid. I wouldn't want to rule that out. And that can be terribly enjoyable. And you can go perform in a job or in whatever it is, doing research. And that's terribly enjoyable. And so you're doing a thing and it's known benefits. Like you enjoy this. These are people like this. The child at that point that you don't have is an unknown benefit. And that's
culture's kind of saying like,
like it's probably not that fun.
Depending where you are, it's
like, exactly right.
Like, that's a waste of your time.
So first of all, you can have conflicting desires. And second of all, you can have sort of like, it's like an incomplete problem because you can't compare something known to something unknown. Have you seen these memes? They're out there, something like you haven't yet met all the people who will love you, right? Like,
oh, no, I haven't. Yeah.
It's a great concept, right? So how are you supposed to decide? Like you're doing this thing and you're good at it and you love it. Like you actually really love whatever it is that you're doing. And that's not everybody's job. A lot of jobs are terrible, but a lot of jobs aren't. You love what you're doing. How are you supposed to just stop that in favor of having a child that has benefits that you cannot imagine, that you didn't experience growing up? You don't know much about it. I think that's right. Like if you ask me like, what would you like to do next week? Would you like to, keep working on what you're working on? Or would you like to like go skydiving? I'd be like, I don't know. That sounds terrifying. I've never been. Somebody who loves skydiving might say, well, you cannot know how great this is till you try it. I'd be like, yep, I'm not trying it. Just sounds terrifying. I could die.
Well, and I don't know. That's like the Atlantic article of the lady.
That is the Atlantic article. But I think you might feel sorry. I don't think we should laugh at that. I think that's exactly how it looks like. I mean, man, when you're at least, I don't know how, I won't say I speak for everybody, but I'll say, man, when I was pregnant with my first, I thought, okay, how is this getting out? Like, I am going to die. This is not, and that's just birth, right? Birth is a terribly scary thing. But, proverbially, like we can extend that feeling of terror to lots of other things. Like I remember concretely thinking my marriage would never be the same again. I thought like, oh, well, that is gone. Like that is gone now. But it wasn't permanently gone. It came back. But it's just like this series of births and that they all look pretty damn terrifying.
Yeah.
I think we should not like say that doesn't count. Like, I think it counts.
No, totally. That's why, like, I didn't. That's why I didn't say I was like. I felt sorry for the young.
You felt
lady.
sorry, yeah.
Like not like even maybe in a paternalistic way of me being like a father.
Like, oh, honey, like just poor thing.
But not in a way like mocking. Yeah, no. That's why I said I think you're making it harder on yourself. Like, and part of that's nature too. Like we're made to be mothers and fathers. And I remember so clearly, my first child getting in the car, driving from the hospital. And I was like, wait, they're letting us keep him? What are we doing?
It's like super universal. It's so weird. You're like, wait, I don't know anything about this baby.
Yeah. It's like, oh my goodness. Yeah. And so, I often say, this is like my wife and I, we have talked about like, well, we have, what else are we going to do?
Yeah.
I mean, and I think there's something else about this that one of my favorite little things I discovered, and then I want to go to education.
Yep.
I discovered this. It was a little Twitter thing. I don't know what it was, but there was a conversation between a mother and her maybe first grader or something. He was in a car seat, English. And she said, you might have seen this. Did you get a place in the nativity play? Did you see this? I
did see that. It was really
cute. And he's like, oh, I got a classic role. Classic. She's like, really? What did you get? Are you Joseph? He's like, no. Are you one of the three wise men? No. Like, are you shepherd? No. He's like, well, what are you? And he says, I'm door holder number 3. He's like, I get to hold doors. And he's totally stoked. And she says, well, were you, that's fantastic, which is also impressive that she was just like, good job. And he goes, are you happy about it? He goes, I was like, door holder number 3, get in there. Let's go. Yeah. And so I liked it so much that, one of my children was playing a basketball game and they played, but they were sitting on the bench at one point. And I looked over at him and he goes, 3, door holder number 3. Like everybody's door holder number 3. Like 99.99% of the world, we're just door holder number 3.
That's right.
No matter how great our work is and what it is, we're all door holder number 3. And so in a sense, and I think this is maybe the point of like feeling sorry, like when you have children, like you pointed out, you said, you don't know what it's like to have these people who love you and who count on you. And yes, it can be up and down. And yes, you're tired, but you're like, it gives meaning to your life. And that combines with your work. And these are the things I thought were really interesting is that one, it didn't mean you could never do anything else.
Right.
as
Right.
all the like professor and you, like we are our
Yeah.
mutual friend, Carrie Gress. She has 5
Mm-hmm.
children. She's like an
Mm-hmm.
entrepreneur. She writes, 2 books a year, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Another a good friend of mine and my wife, our family friends, they have 8 children. She also runs a business, and
Mm-hmm.
she's just like, there's a lot of people who are, and Carrie's been on this podcast before, but this other
Mm-hmm.
lady, Shannon Went, runs a company called Choose Life. And I've
Mm-hmm.
interviewed her for the Gospel of Work project I did with
Mm-hmm.
Andreas at Catholic U.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, wouldn't miss it for the world, right? And I think there's that sense
Right.
of excitement that I like how you brought up. Like, you can't really know until you try. But I think, in a sense, this is also a problem, not just for mothers. And I want to go back to education, but for fathers. And one of the problems you see for men today,
Mm-hmm.
men who are not caring for their children, or men don't have work, men separated, single motherhood, and
Mm-hmm.
the marriage penalties on poor people that encourage women not to get married because they would lose
Yeah.
benefits.
Right.
Like, in a sense, there's, what are men working for? Like,
Yeah.
for who? For what? Right. And I think that there's a purpose that comes in having children that gets you through the ups and downs of other parts of your life. And I don't mean they're commodities. I mean that they're people in your life. Do you want to comment on that? I mean, do you think I'm phrasing that incorrectly? What do you think?
No, I think that's like 1,000% right. I mean, certainly, like, I think I touched on this a little bit. Our mutual friend Brad Wilcox talks about this, but there's something we're getting really backwards about men and family and work right now, which is, right, we think like men have to have it all figured out before they start their families. In fact, a kid asked me this 3 days ago after class. He said, Professor, like, I've got a girlfriend, and I'm just a junior, and do you think like I need to wait till I finish college and get a job before I propose to her? And, that's like our general thought. But in fact, what the data says is, like, men with kids are better providers, that it gives them a purpose and they work harder, and and that's kind of mysterious, actually. Like, I think you probably just summed it up really well, right? It gives some kind of purpose. I mean, it's certainly, I don't think it looks the same for women as for men, but I have many female friends whose job is door holder number 3. And they, and they don't love doing that. They would rather be home, but because, the financial situation, they're going to be doing that. And what gets you through it is like, well, I can do this to pay tuition for my kids to go to school, or whatever it is, And we should not underestimate the, like, buoying effect on people's work and the just general economic situation from a lot of people thinking that it's their job in life. Their purpose is to provide for a bunch of, like, totally adorable kids who are depending on them coming home with a bicycle at Christmas,
So you got to hold the door.
Yeah, got to hold the door. Yep.
Yeah.
I think you're right.
So there's a lot we could do there, but we're kind of going quickly. But I'd like to talk about this question of education a bit, and back to that story. And there are several in there.
Yeah.
Several of the people who you interview are, like, they're college professors, they're very highly educated, physicians, and et cetera. But we talk about the Terry, who Teresa, her mother saying to her, I don't want you to think this is a waste to have your education. But anyway, she says this, she goes through this, her mother telling her that. And I was thinking about this and talking to my wife about this, that somehow, I think there's 2 things maybe. One is that if you spend all this time getting educated, well, you've wasted it if you're not going to be working fully. And so I'd like you to comment on that. But here's another thing that I've thought about, and maybe this makes me an outlier, but and feel free to critique it. Maybe it's badly said, whatever. I actually do make mistakes, so I'm making this wrong. But this is how I have been thinking about it. A lot of times you're going to hear, you do hear a lot of times, not a lot, sometimes I should say, you'll hear occasionally, especially in conservative circles where there are a lot of children, and the high cost of college and the inability. I mean, you can't send 6, 7, 8 children to school at $40,000 a year each, which is, like, not going to happen. I mean, and especially if you have, 2 or 3 in college at the same time, right? So you have to get scholarships and everything, and you think about debt.
Yep.
And sometimes I hear, like, well, maybe the girls don't need to go to college. And I actually think if you want to go to college, you should go to college. I have children who are like, I don't want to go to college. I have others who are like, they're probably going to get a PhD. Like, it's like, and even the ones who say, I don't know if I want to go to college. This one, I think he could even get a PhD, but he's a boy. Anyway, that's a long way of getting to this point. I kind of think really, if it comes down to it, it's probably more important for the girls to go to a college. And I mean a good college, right? And so like I'm Catholic, so I'm not talking about some state school where you study, feminist women's studies or whatever. I'm talking about like, if you go to a good, solid college, you get good formation in philosophy and theology and then science or economics, whatever else you want to do, but you get that good formation and you build good friendships.
Yeah.
And then you go out and maybe you're called to be a doctor, a lawyer, an economist, and you get married. And it ends up that you have a master's degree or a PhD or a bachelor's, and you spend the next 25 years of your life not working and taking care of children. As the father and then the grandfather of those children, I don't have any grandchildren, but the future grandfather, I want you to be highly educated, know what you're talking about, be able to teach your children, influence your children. And if your husband is a very successful plumber with a high school degree who loves God and reads, but doesn't have, like, in some ways, it's more important for the wife and the mother to have the education, right? And so it's a very interesting, because I guess that's maybe makes me an outlier. It's as long as the education is good, culture is passed down in the family. The mother is the force of this. And don't we want highly educated, competent women to do this? And the next point is, like, you obviously have a PhD from Harvard and you've taken time off to raise your 8 children. A family friend of ours, she has like an MBA and finance and was working and all these things, takes care, does, homeschools her and partially homeschools her 6 children. Another friend of ours, the both of them are physicians. She's a plastic surgeon. And you know what she does? She stopped practice and she takes care of her children, raises her children. And she's like, great, right? Because she likes being a mother. But all the benefit of the education wasn't a waste. It was poured into her children that matter the most. So that was a long way of getting to this point. But how do you react to that? And how do we think about education and motherhood?
Yeah. Well,
and
I'll just react.
Push back or disagree.
No. What I'll do is just like offer observations related to the ones you did. One funny thing about what you just described is actually, like, it sounds like you're describing the world we're increasingly living in, right? So increasingly men are opting out of college, and they're a lot more likely to be looking into these sort of technical degrees and technical careers. Women really like college, probably in part because it's social, and in part because they're maybe less concerned about sort of the ROI or whatever that looks like. So it's funny, I couldn't resist kind of smiling when you're describing this world. I thought maybe the market is sorting this out. And actually that's what's going to happen, is we're going to have women in college and men doing technical jobs that don't require college. And we don't just mean like technical, vocational technical, like with your hands. I mean, increasingly programmers don't need to go to college, right? I mean, we're seeing the tech world saying, hey, we don't need you to have a college degree. So I think that, that's one argument would be like, maybe that's exactly what we're seeing, a kind of correction in the market for that underlying thing. I agree with you. So listen, a lot of what we're hearing, I don't know, in this, like, maybe we'll just call it like the reactionary circles in the right now, would be sort of, women should stop going to college. Women should stop getting graduate degrees, because that's the problem here. Like, the problem is, kind of, we'll just call it like some kind of feminist thing that says women have to be emancipated and they go get education. So just because some people are maybe pursuing education for the wrong reasons doesn't mean we should reject the whole thing. So I get this. I actually get people emailing me saying, the more you go out and talk about family, because you have a PhD, you're just going to do damage. Like, people will see this and they'll go out and get PhDs and they won't have kids. And I'm like, but why would that be the thing? Like, I had kids, So 100% what you said. I think that women's education, vis-a-vis the exciting vocation of raising a bunch of kids, is terribly important. And I'm not saying that's the only reason it's important. It's just one of the many reasons it's important and good. I think Chesterton says something about this someplace, like at least in relation, not to education per se, but he talks about, well, what is the vocation of raising a person? Is like, you have to be the generalist who introduces them to little parts of the entire world. And so you would think that a really fine liberal education is what any good mother should try to have, right? If she can have it. So that would be my first thing. But then I would definitely want to say that, well, one of the problems with our current like educational paths on offer, which we probably want to talk about, not necessarily today, but like as a people, is what we're doing education wise is like terribly inefficient, right? So what we see is possible in small communities like classical academies and homeschoolers is we know that you don't have to spend 18 years getting the equivalent of a high school education.
Mm-hmm.
And we really do need to think about the timeline of these things for women, because they don't have all the time in the world, because they're really quite fertile at the end of their teens and their early 20s, mid 20s, all the way through their 20s. I mean, for me, my own fertility dropped dramatically. I'm not complaining. I was richly blessed, but there was like a total change. Like my 20s was one thing and my 30s was another thing. And I didn't expect that to come when I was 30. I expected that to come when I was 40. And so we have to be a lot more willing to kind of start to play with that, like the scriptedness of the timeline. You know, you do 8 years of this and you do 4 years of this, and then you do 4 more years of this. And all of that time we're eating away at the time when it makes most sense for people to get married, for women to get married, we'll say that. Mm-hmm. So yeah, my basic thought is I think you're right. Education is not a waste if you're going to be a mom. It's terribly, terribly wonderful and important. But that we probably want to think about finding creative ways to kind of challenge the normal path.
Yeah, that's good. That's interesting.
Alternative credentialing. Yeah. We got to be more efficient. We can't have women getting their law degrees when they're, 27 or, finishing medical school when they're 30. That is probably a bad deal. But I mean, I think that, basically, I think high school is incredibly wasteful for most people. And, if we really got serious about doing something meaningful and efficient, it wouldn't look like what we have now.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually a super important point. And I think, it's important in a lot of ways. I mean, one is you're right. You have to wait forever. The other thing is shifting those things, right?
Yeah, 100%.
So there was a very
going
interesting
back to school, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Well, there's I don't know if you heard this, but it was Jordan Peterson was interviewing Camille Paglia. It was a long time ago.
Did not hear this. Yeah.
Okay. It's very interesting, actually, in a lot of ways. And, Camille Paglia is like, definitely,
she's wild.
She's wild. Yeah. So she said a couple of things in there that I remember. She said, and she's very left and very, she said, the problem with all these, in her accent, the problem with all these women, she said, it's funny. She said, they don't really maybe know their father very much, maybe, busy or whatever. Like, just kind of like went to school and everything. They don't have brothers, and many of them, and they're not married, and they don't have sons. So they don't understand boys. And she said, like, why don't we make space in all these, like you said, she's kind of criticized. I mean, she's very left, but she was criticizing feminist studies and gender. She said, why don't we create the conditions for women with children who have boys to come back and they do their doctorates? Because this would completely transform the way women's studies is done if you actually have women who have sons.
Totally. It's a great point.
Isn't that a neat point? But I think it's a double point of like knowledge, but also the structure is kind of based on an industrial factory model. This is even how schools, everything's a factory.
Yeah.
And even classical schools are run like a classical.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. No, for sure. They're just doing the same thing. I mean, like we just assume you got to go someplace at 9 a.m. You got to leave at 3 p.m. And like, obviously like, my opinion is this, what we're seeing is a whole industry that hasn't adapted or innovated because of a certain pattern, which is normed by the government schools. But we got to get away from a lot of that. To Palia's point, I mean, I would not be the college teacher that I am today if I hadn't raised a bunch of boys. Because the boys I meet in my classroom, I understand them because I have boys of the same age. I would have had no idea what to do with them. I would have thought certain behaviors were, I don't know, like disrespectful. I would have thought they had no idea what they were doing. I would have been like the classic
all true.
Female.
They are disrespectful and have no idea what they're doing.
But you have to see through it. You see it. You're like, you're a genius. Like you have so much to offer. You're such a disaster. You're not dressing well. That's okay. Like, tell me what you really like. What are you interested in? We're going to connect. Like, I couldn't have done that if I hadn't had sons. Like, right. It just wouldn't have been possible.
It's funny.
There's got to be so many things like that women would be better in the working world if we knew what men were like.
Yeah, that's interesting. I actually have a memory. You wouldn't remember this, but my oldest, who's 20, it must have been, he was 14 or 15. And because you saw him, we came to an acting event, you were there. And
Okay.
I introduced you. I was with my wife, and you said, "You're 14." And he looked at you and he's kind of shy and everything, smiling. You said, 14's great. See, you haven't hit the moodiness of the teenager yet. You have still the hope and everything. And he remembered it. And he kind of he just liked this lady understands me,
Yeah.
And I think it is very sweet because my wife and I were talking about this. I was like, think about, how much about men being married for over 20 years and having 3 boys.
Right.
She's like, oh my goodness, and she also had 3 brothers. So understanding, and Paulina makes this point. If you don't have any brothers, she's like, women who tend to work really well with men generally grew up with a lot of brothers. And this goes to that point of kind of loneliness and the treed cat that Mary Eberstadt makes. A lot of times we don't know how to do things. Right. We get stuck in the tree because we weren't taught by our siblings of, the cat to get down.
Like how to get down.
How to relate. So I know we've taken tons of your time, but I want to just go over a couple of quick things. This is really great and such it's a great book. So listeners, definitely read the book. And it's funny because it's quite a joyful book. It's great. I like it a lot. You just feel like you're thinking about hard problems. You're critiquing social and economic studies and trying to make a point that maybe our models are broken. And in the midst of it, all these great kind of stories. So I definitely recommend the book very highly. A couple of things I wanted to address, maybe not in any particular order. I just think maybe quickly, we touched on it, but I think maybe worth hitting on completely.
Yeah.
There's a notion these women are religiously brainwashed women, but they think it's good. Could you just address that? That would be, I think, a critique. A lot of people are going to think about women with big families.
Yeah. Well, this is good. It takes us back to the beginning of our conversation. And I think if you ask the guy on the street or, my dad or, whoever he's like, well, there's a few people out there still having kids and they probably have a sense that they're religious. So it's a stereotype. They're, Catholic or Mormon, right? People that have other kids, Catholic or Mormon, right? And what does that mean? And the concern is that people just sort of assume, I don't know, Catholics and Mormons are brainwashed or they do this for unthinking reasons. And in fact, one of the things I wanted to bring out of the stories, and you see that, is the women reacting to that. They feel that stereotype, that the reason they walk around with their 7 or their 5 kids is because they just, it's a funny thing when you think about it. You're like, how would brainwashing exactly work? How would that actually, none of us really could describe that, but somehow that you're unthinking, that you do something because you've been told to do it or something. Certainly it's a challenge to something like female agency and things like that. I tend to think that people act for purposes. And so if we talk to them long enough, we can figure out what their purposes are. Now, when I say that I think they act for purposes, I don't mean that all purposes are good. There can be bad purposes. But I think that people act for purposes. So if you talk to them long enough, and this is what I heard, was that however they got there, you mentioned Mickey, who had a Japanese background and met her husband in graduate school who had a different approach. And I think that's her language. She talks about that stereotype. She says when she grew up, the only people she knew with a lot of kids were Filipinos with big families or Mormons. And she says, she feels the weight of that stereotype today, that people think you're doing it just because and not because you think it's good. And that's her language. That was something I was after. Well, what is it that made you think it was good? How did you come to this? Yeah. So yeah, there were a lot of ways people did come to it, but I thought that was important because once you know what it is that people need to discover or what they went through to find out that this was good, well, then you go back to that question, are these the red birthmark people, or are they vitamin D people? Because there's something about discovering it's good, which is possibly something that can be repeated, as a treatment or as a program. And where does that come from, right? So you did raise obliquely, a lot of people want to think about how we can improve the birth rate, if that's even a good goal for countries to have. But I kind of felt after talking to these people, if you did have that goal, if you thought it would be a good idea to try to raise the birth rate, it would be much more important to go about that by examining the kinds of value-shaping institutions we come in contact with, right? And, so you raise the question of religion. Well, it's not just any old kind of religion. There's certain kinds of traditional religions that foster this sense of transcendence, the sense of the subjectivity of the person, that this person is a radical, unrepeatable other. I mean, these are all things that are embedded in, I would say, typically, Judeo and Christian religious experiences, but you can certainly find them in Hindus and Muslims and people of other types of faiths. So, right, that's rational, right? You're doing this because you believe it's good, but it's not a mystery where it comes from. It's not something that we can't try to repeat or we can't try to share with others. Like you could never become that kind of person. And that's why it's good news, right? I think there's something great. Maybe I put it like we can share the stories of our children, and that if the truth we're sharing is true, like if it's truth, that on its own will have the effect of causing others to see children as valuable.
I completely agree. I mean, so I have a talk I've given, and in fact, the last episode I released in the podcast was a kind of a distilled version of this longer talk, but I have this talk on 5 false anthropologies, and then how to think about it. And like the person as a cog, or the person as a commodity, which we've talked about, the person as a scourge, they're going to hurt the planet. And also I talk about transhumanism and plastic anthropology. But the point that I say is like, well, there's actually a good news about the person, that the person has a purpose, has meaning, being is good. And I think like this is really big, especially when you think about Catholic women and Orthodox Jewish women, right? Who you talk about.
Yeah.
There's something radical. Ratzinger points this out, and listeners know I like Ratzinger. So Ratzinger points this out in his homilies in the 1980s in this beautiful book called In the Beginning. And if you haven't read it, it's great. And he says, something radical is going on in the Hebrew Bible, because creation is good, being is good, matter is good, your body is good. It's so good you get it back at the end, and in Christian, right? In the creed, right? We say that in the creed, but that matter is good, and that your body is not something to escape from. And I think part of this is a big, maybe a can of worms too late in the interview, but I do think that there's a certain disdain for the goodness of matter, disdain for the goodness of being. I think a very profound book, which I talk about a lot on this podcast, is by Carl Stern, his book, Flight from Woman. This is an excellent book. And in Flight from Woman, the flight from woman is also a flight from motherhood, and also a flight from the body, flight from children. And I think this is maybe the sad part, and this is the kind of the wanting. If you think being is good, and matter is good, and bodies are good, and children is good, and marriage is good, well, then you have this sense of meaning, purpose, and hope. And so you want children. Right. But if you think being is bad, your body's something to escape from, the climate isn't doom, you're just a cog, well, it makes sense you don't want children. It's rational. Right. And so that's not, in one sense, you could see that as a critique, but because I think being is good, and I can make coherent arguments of why I think it's good. But if you don't think it's good, in a sense, it's kind of understandable. And so I think part of what we're dealing with is the reason people don't want children, there's a birth dearth, is because nihilism abounds. Do you think what do you think in your...
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think the story in the book, which most echoes, I think, the kinds of things you're talking about now, is like Angela's story. She's kind of deep. I mean, she's a college teacher as well. But she has this phrase, she says, like, at the end of the day, like, I just think people matter. She's like, people matter. Yeah. People matter. And she says things like, my autonomy doesn't matter, like that, but people matter. Sort of being in relationship with people matters. And so, I mean, she has her own turns of phrase, but I think you're entirely right. Like at the end of the day, this kind of anthropology, or kind of like what you think about people is going to inform like your sense of how much you want to surround yourself with people. So Angela also talks about this idea that she thinks embedded in the way she grew up in a certain type of African-American culture, these are her words, is a kind of like, you're not threatened by other people. Like other people aren't a threat to your sense of self. And she puts that pretty radically. And I think it was really challenging to read that and interesting.
Yeah, it's not a zero-sum game, right? That's right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so I'm just reacting to your point about kind of rejection of the body and a rejection of personhood, a rejection of, I mean, at the end of the day, like I think that's right. So she throws up her hands. She's like, why do I have a house full of persons? Well, because I think persons matter. I think people matter. Like it's like the most important thing I can do. And I'm not threatened by them. Like, so people sometimes use this language, like if you have a bunch of kids, if you have too many kids, you're going to lose who you are, right? You can only have a few until your sense of self starts to be threatened. And she says, well, how would that be possible? Like I'm better with more people, right? So it's really contrasting two different ways of thinking about another person. And how deep is that? Where does that come from? When do we first kind of feel threatened by other people versus augmented by other people, right? I'm better with more people around. So I don't know, I'm just reacting, but I think it's a deep point.
Well, and I think it's a zero-sum game. So it's funny because like the economics and the philosophy get together on this, right? If being is good and you don't think there's a zero-sum game,
right?
Like, okay, it doesn't mean that there's not a cost, right? It's not what we're saying, but that you can't go on as many vacations, whatever. But I think, the other thing that comes out in your book, we'll just go through this maybe quickly because I know you have a life. We've got 2 hours already.
That's good.
This happens at multiple points. Like my marriage is better. Our marriage is better. We get along. Right. And that's, so the sense of self is very interesting. I'm a better person and I'm more patient and my marriage is better. And we're like in a project together.
We're like on a mission. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's a surprise. Another part of the book that's a surprise to people. Like, wait, that's why I think like your book is good for like all the sociological reasons. But I think just like the hope reasons, like I think a young person could read this book and say, oh, wait a minute, you create what Peter Berger calls plausibility structures.
Right.
And the nice thing, of course, as you know, and we both know because both of us have large families, one thing that happens that we always kind of joke, like once you have like 6, 7 children, you never get invited to small family's house anymore. Because it's like a van, it's like a clown car. They just keep coming out. And they're like, oh my goodness. Right. But it's hilarious how many times you get invited to big families. And so like you'll have a party like 4 families and there's like 40 children, or okay, that's maybe too much, but 6 families and there's 40 children. And you're like, oh, normal. Yeah. And you realize like, oh, this is possible and plausible. Yeah. And yes, you're tired, but it's great. But could you just talk a little bit about perhaps a shocking claim? It helps your marriage. It doesn't mean it's always easy, right?
No.
But could you talk about that? Because I think, again, it's very counterintuitive. You lose yourself, you don't have your marriage. And you mentioned that, like I was worried I was going to not have my marriage.
Yeah.
But now you have something bigger.
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to come back to what your Berger quote, because I really like that. But yeah, Leah says, for instance, in one of the last chapters, he says, well, like our marriage is better because we just have more to offer each other. And why do we have more to offer each other? Because we've grown through challenge, right? So yeah, I mean, I tried to appeal to some of these different models that people might have. Like we all get that, like if you're going to do something great in sports, you're going to have to like suffer, your muscles have to get broken down. Like it's just pain but you're going to grow. Like you're going to grow.
The Kobe Bryant, that's your Kobe Bryant.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Kobe Bryant.
That was a good one. Yeah. Why don't you,
that's a good one.
It's a really good one. Why don't you talk about that?
Yeah. So I was really looking for kind of like epic statements of purpose because I was exploring what statements of purpose look like when I was writing this book. And I came across this interview he did, which is up on YouTube. And I think I quoted, people can go look it up. It's really inspiring. And of course,
God rest his soul. Notes.
Yeah, please do. God rest his soul. I mean, Kobe Bryant was a really, seemed to be, I mean, I can't pronounce judgment, seemed to be a great person. But he does this great interview where he's talking about purpose. He's being asked about how he kept playing basketball during a really epic and important game where he injured his Achilles. It's a very painful injury, or was it his hamstring? I think it was Achilles injury. Anyway, he's talking about that. He says, look, I tell the story this way, like, right, you have this injury, but, let's say your house is burning down and your wife and your kids are upstairs. He says, like, you're not going to think about the injury to your hamstring. You're going to run upstairs and like get them out. And you're going to do everything you have to do. And he says, because the lives of your children and your family are more important to you than the pain in your leg. And I thought that is a great description of purpose right there. That kind of sums it up. And so that's like, okay, so he talks about the game being his purpose, being the best at the game is that kind of purpose. But obviously when he gives that example, you think to yourself, okay, so that might tell us something about how Kobe feels about his family. That was really touching and worth quoting.
Yeah.
So your larger question about marriage, I mean, this is kind of what we heard. I mean, it was kind of like anything challenging that you do in life, especially if it's oriented towards something objectively great. Athletic achievement is objectively great. Having children is objectively great. It's a great accomplishment. But it's stress. We stress ourselves in a sense, like I don't know, it's like fasting, right? Fasting is something we put ourselves in a state of stress, but we know we get healing out of that. It's only something we're discovering recently, right? Like this ancient practice of fasting makes us better. And it's just that people haven't thought about how children do the same thing for us, right? So it's like, well, would you be a better wife or a better husband if you could get off the couch and lose 30 pounds that you've accumulated over the last decade? And, I mean, everybody would say yes. Like, obviously, you'd probably be a better spouse if you could lose weight or you learned a new skill. And having children seems to be like that. I mean, at least I'm just going off these testimonies. It was kind of like that. It was like, look, if you can learn to manage a full household in this way, your heart gets bigger, you gain all these relationship skills. I mean, 100% you see things in your children that are like the child of your spouse. So you're seeing in your child, well, this must be what my husband was like as a boy. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean it as like, wow, okay, that kid who can't pull away from that really complicated problem, or he's going to build his Lego set all day. You're like, well, that's kind of cute, actually. And well, now I can sort of appreciate better how come my husband doesn't want to leave the golf course. So that makes me more understanding. Whereas before I thought it was just self-indulgent. Well, I don't see my 7-year-old son building Legos as self-indulgent. I think of it as terribly cute, right? I'm like, oh, I got to protect his time playing. But you see how that might make me a better wife, right?
It's great.
And it's just like, it's like super practical. So yeah, we heard that a lot. So I thought it was worth saying. It was like worth kind of pulling it out. Just before we finish, well, I don't know when you want to finish. It's up to you. You're in charge. I'm having a great time.
Thanks for this is so great. I'm learning so much.
You mentioned Peter Berger, and I just love that statement, plausibility structures. I'm going to have to look that up and see where he talks about that. I keep saying that one of the things I think this book is doing is it's a proof by existence, right? So it's not necessarily a proof by argument, right? It's not like, here's all the reasons why like this could work or this could be good. It's just like, let me just show you, like, if it can happen once, right? If it can happen once, you can find it once. Like I found one, like Bigfoot's out there. Like I got one description. There could be 10 Bigfoots.
And it's not a red birthmark.
It's not a red birthmark. Exactly right.
It's vitamin D.
Proof by existence. It's vitamin D. Exactly. Let's all get some more vitamin D. So yeah, plausibility structures, you reveal that something is possible. There was one woman I don't think I put this story in the book. I've got obviously hundreds of stories I couldn't put in the book. Oh, maybe I did. No, I don't think this is in the book. I've talked about it before. And she was at the playground. She recalls being at the playground with a whole bunch of kids. I think she ended up having 10 or 11 kids. And she's at the playground at some point with a bunch of kids. And some other mom at the playground comes up to her and she says, do you mind if I ask, like, are all these kids yours? And she says, well, yeah. And she says, well, how many do you have? And the woman I talked to said, well, it's a lot, so it's 7 or 8 or whatever. And the woman just looked at her and said, you can do that? Like, and I don't, wow, yeah, that's right. It's like, that's like a plausibility structure. It's like, it's never, right? I mean, you're not like, well, she wasn't asking, like, do you have permission, right? I mean, this isn't a country where it's illegal to have kids. It's just, she just didn't know you could do it. It's hard, but that's such a simple expression of like, I didn't know this was plausible.
And that's why you see, like, this is kind of classic. Like, I did an interview with Jeff Bloom and Rabbi Jeremy Kagan on their book, Strauss and Sinai and Spinoza. And Jeff and I were talking, and you see this like with Orthodox Jewish neighborhoods and Catholic neighborhoods. Like you go up to the church and there's vans everywhere. And for young people they come, they're just kind of like, oh. Yeah. And what, like Jeff said, like he said he wasn't Orthodox. He looked into the Orthodox world like a window and thought, oh, I want that. I can do that. And I think that's the other thing about the plausibility structure. You're sold, this is what you must do. This is the way, this is success, this is success. And then you see, wait a minute, like seems happy and fulfilled and peaceful and have all these children around her. And, sometimes, I mean, like, let's not overstate it. I mean, like sometimes you're exhausted. Right. Okay. But like, that's where we have my line. Rebecca's like, you have to say your line on the podcast. Like, what else are we going to do? I mean, we're door holder number 3. Like there's not very many, and so I think there's that element to it. And I like the sports analogy. I mean, I like sports and have the children play sports. And I think sports are
actually
good
I learned to love sports because I had kids.
Did you? Okay. Yeah, I played them and I love them. And I have my daughters are about to go to a basketball game here in a minute. I think sports are good for boys for many reasons. I think sports are good for girls for important reasons of they experience themselves as subjects in a non-sexual way, where there's so much commodification of girls. It's like very important, right. And of course, like this goes to a point, you can play sports, be super good at sports and have bad character. You can be a jerk. You can be
Right.
not good. Like having children, it doesn't just automatically make you good, right? You have
Right.
to work.
No.
But what I like about that image, and you use Kobe Bryant, I really like the tennis player Novak Djokovic. And he actually is a big Kobe Bryant fan. They were friends, I guess. And
I didn't know that.
yeah, and when he actually wore when he won his 24th Grand Slam, he put on, or Masters, I should say, not 20%, but he put on a 24 shirt for Kobe Bryant because he was really inspired by him. And this example, one of the greatest tennis matches ever was the last year's Cincinnati Open. I mean, he was having heat stroke against Carlos Alcaraz. He kind of came back and won. And it was this example of the human spirit. And I think that's why sports is great, because the mother waking up at 2:00 in the morning, changing diapers, nursing, cleaning, throw up, like it is not exciting. You don't get awards, but it's like the challenge of the human spirit. And like, again, I think we can say it doesn't mean it's easy. Sometimes you have to work through it.
Absolutely.
But I think there's something I think about, like myself, right? I'm very impatient. I'm just like, come on. And so usually I don't talk personally, but my 3-year-old just like, come on, get your sock on. You're the most annoying sock. And of course my wife is like, oh my goodness, I know whose son that is. Right. And so, but I'm patient. But the point is, I think about myself and I think I've had people tell me, Michael, you're very patient. And I'm thinking, you have no idea how impatient I am. But I realized, well, they think I'm patient because guess what? I am more patient.
You have become more patient.
I have become more patient. And that's a gift of living together. Right. And I'm not trying to, like, if I sound enthusiastic, listeners, because what else are you going to do? It's great. Right. But that doesn't mean it's always easy. It doesn't mean that you have, and I'm blessed. Like my life is very easy. I know some families really struggle. They have other challenges and illness. I don't have some of those challenges. So my life is easier. I recognize that. And I'm not trying to say like, this is the model, but I'm trying to say like, I think I'm kind of going back to that, Rachel, I wish I could remember her last name. I'm not trying to like single her out in a bad way, but in a sense that I felt for her, because it was like the idea that children are going to overcome you. As you said, you're going to lose yourself. They're going to destroy you. But actually, as the example you gave, I think Angela, right? Other people are not a threat. They make you come alive. And they also, and you talk about this in your book a lot, they help the children come alive. The children have friends. The children have to learn how to relate. It's just much harder for a single child to get out into the world and go to college and work because they haven't been fighting. They haven't been fighting for 18 years, and so I think there's just so many human positives about it. And I guess maybe I'm sounding enthusiastic because so much of the narrative is like how dark and miserable it is, when in fact it's kind of fun.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think it is kind of fun. I mean, I hope, obviously like my stories are not stories of tragedy, that it wasn't the project, but I do profile people talking about some of the darker, difficult times. I mean, certainly some of that comes out. I hope don't get the impression these people think their lives are all roses. But this kind of good news, like there's kind of, I mean, certainly towards the back end, some of these stories of people dealing with real sicknesses or illnesses, and the way in which surprisingly, having a larger family contributed to, recovering and that kind of thing. So I think that's exactly right. In a sense, like what else you're going to devote yourself to something, right? So why not this? There's a funny quote at the beginning of the book, right? Where the eponymous Hannah, who you meet in the second chapter. And I think she says something like, look, everybody's searching for an identity, like tattoo yourself, like get a new religion, what a way to find identity than just like have a bunch of kids. Like, why not? Like, why not kids? And that's like a really nice sort of simple, like, I mean, why not? Like, there's a lot of worse things you could do with your time.
And if you think they're an everlasting destiny, what does C.S. Lewis say? You're either an immortal horror or an everlasting splendor.
Right.
An everlasting splendor. That's where I like that line on 103. Like God said, thank you for doing this. Like you're participating with God to create a person. Like this is awesome, and I think that goes to the goodness of being, I guess. So maybe I'll finish two things. One from the beginning of your book, you talk about David Brooks and this idea, and then you get into like, Hungary's child policy and Australia's child policy. And at the end, these are kind of related. Just a two-part question. At the end, your last chapter is the future of the nation. You say you have a section called "Let the Temple Flourish," meaning the sociological things end up kind of being a religious question. Could you talk maybe about the Brooks and the child policy, and then really how that you've done it a little bit, but maybe kind of end there with that religious aspect?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So David Brooks' point, Brooks noticed, this was back in the 2000 election. He was kind of early on to the fact that the red-blue voting patterns there were some family demographics that correlated with that. It wasn't just people on the right or people on the left, but people voting red generally had like larger families. I mean, he was commenting on other people commenting. It was just like, so he called the red diaper babies. I mean, it was a great column. It was a great image. I remember reading it when it came out at the time and thinking like, oh, he's pointing to something. This was back in the days when people speculated back in 2000, like we may never have a close election again because it's just going to be these like family voters are going to outvote the urban voters. And I think those people just didn't understand like the numbers.
Right. And by the way, just for listeners, like this, but like, so the humor there is red diaper babies, right, are people who are raised by communists. Right. That's what red diaper baby is. And he means red diaper baby that they're going to vote Republican because they have children. Yeah. So that's the clever.
Exactly. Yeah. But then I've been looking at a lot of research by demographers, in preparation to work on this book and some of it before stuff I was interested in. And I discovered that demographers have actually checked to see how strong these correlations are between like, how many sort of traditionally married families there are with children in a particular voting precinct and what direction they vote in. Now, of course, what happens over time between elections, people move and they shift around. So it's not like this isn't like the same district doesn't always vote the same way. That's why.
And plus you have Trump and Biden, which throws
throws everything off.
Everything off. So anyway, keep going.
But they basically said, wow, like, when they look at the correlations between these family variables and they look at kind of traditional family formation and numbers of children versus like the votes, the red-blue votes, they basically said, wow, like actually what David Brooks is commenting on was really robust and probably more robust than David Brooks knew at the time. They went all the way back and they found that correlation really emerged strongly in the 1990s. And that correlation between sort of traditional family structures and being more likely to vote Republican and vice versa, it emerged in the 1990s. And then they found it continued just as strongly past those Bush-Gore elections. And even through, I think the last one I looked at was 2016 election. So now going back 8 years. So they even thought that the Trump election was mostly like in the books based on the demographics. Super interesting, right? So like this is, I guess, trying to get at what you're asking. And I just try to lay that out for the reader. Like, this is about more things than you realize, right? Like there's more stuff here than we realize. We don't have it all figured out, right? But somehow the families we form and the way we experience family maps into certain principles that we think are important in political life. Okay, so just leave that there. What does that mean? Super interesting. So it's very consequential in a sense, right? You asked about the... Well,
yeah, maybe I complete the question. Maybe wasn't a very good one, so that's my fault. But I was actually thinking of like how Brooks is talking about politics, and then you look at early in there, you talk about family policy, and there's this sense of like, oh, well, we need family policy to keep, and not so much with red, blue America questions, but just wait, we need families because families provide this whole question of like stability, pensions, everything. So there's actually worry about this, but that they haven't really worked. And so I was thinking about the political versus the cultural religious, I guess. Cultural. But I probably messed up the question.
No, you didn't mess it up. I just want to make sure I answered your question. So yeah, exactly. I mean, this basically what we're looking at is that the source of so many things seems to be sort of really, really much more early than we realize. Like, so it's baked into these different sort of family experiences. And so cultural versus policy. Yeah. I mean, the cultural is the stronger lever. And we know it's a stronger lever. I could spend 20 minutes and I don't want to do that because I think we're probably at the risk of sort of tiring your listeners. But if what you find out when you talk to a whole bunch of people who are doing something different in terms of family, if what you find out is they're not doing this because it was like the best economic decision they could make, right? You find out that they're doing it whether they're rich or poor, because they just think that this is so important to do, then you can't avoid the question of why is it that some people find that this is really important to do, which is a question of where their values came from. And so for the majority of the people that I studied, their values were either coming from or highly shaped by very traditional religious communities that essentially see God's participation in the world as real and living and active, and that the providence of God extends not only to the abundance of our economy and our society, but also to the care he takes of our families. This is like really important. So where do you come to believe those things? So I thought, well, we know that 40 years of family policy doesn't work very well. And what do I mean? It doesn't work for raising birth rates. I'm not here to campaign against child tax credits or other things that governments might try to do to make it easier or better for people who are raising children to do so. I mean, if you went around your neighborhood and handed out new sneakers to a lot of people, you're not going to get a lot more people running marathons. Because why? Like, not a lot of people want to run a marathon. And if they do, they're probably not limited by not having a good pair of sneakers. So, family policy to raise the birth rate is probably not going to be that effective. It hasn't been for 40 years. Well, what can make a difference is...
Can I interject for 1 second?
Yeah.
Because I want you to talk about what makes a difference, but just related to this. So I just interviewed for this film I'm directing a lot of people, and I interviewed Robert Rector and Bob Woodson, and I've interviewed Anthony Bradley on what we have seen is that family policy that penalizes marriage can affect. Sure. So it's interesting. It can affect.
It's asymmetric. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Can you maybe just I don't want to go too far, but
that's a fair point. We haven't talked about that. Yeah. Look, if you want something to take place, right? You think about an activity you want it to take place. People have to want to do it, especially if it's hard, right? You can't give people the drive to run marathons if they don't already want to do it. They've got to come to that somehow. But if you've got a whole bunch of people chomping at the bit to run marathons and you come and break their legs, you can definitely stop them from running marathons, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the way I think about it. It's like we're thinking about an activity, having children, which is like running a marathon. It's actually a lot harder than that. It lasts longer than that. And so the family policy question has to think about how do we not break people's legs? We don't want to get in the way for people. So for sure, you can discourage people from having babies. China did it successfully for a long, long time. And there might be other things we're currently doing. And we want to remove the obstacles for sure. But though
especially for poor people are not getting married, having babies actually.
Correct.
Because of so many obstacles against marriage.
Penalties and obstacles. We got to go find them. Yeah, for sure. What I want to caution in that view is when we're thinking about the sort of diagnostic condition of the West, we're thinking about Western countries that are richer than have ever been wealthy before, right? So the overall problem might be true for some poor working class communities. The overall problem we're facing is not a problem of resource constraints or getting more money to people. That's not the problem we're facing. But 100% is clear, especially given the complexity of our tax code and the complexity of our housing regulations that make it more or less possible to build housing in certain areas, all kinds of things. We could be discouraging births in lots of ways. And we should be actively trying to figure out which ways we're discouraging births. I just don't think, even if we find all the hidden ways we're discouraging births, it's not going to reverse the trend. We have to find out how to make more people want to run marathons. And to do that, we have to talk about how good it is to run marathons and if it's true, right? I mean, I don't know if it's true. You're not going to break your legs. You're going to survive. You're going to lose weight. It's going to be the best thing you've ever done. You're going to want to run another marathon once you'd want to talk about those things. And there's these people who do this, who run marathons and talk about how great it is.
They're wrong for the record. They're totally
wrong. They are probably wrong. I think they probably are wrong. I have no
You're
desire
right.
to ever
it's good
run a
to have
marathon.
children.
Yeah, but that's right. I think that's right. But that puts you in a tough position because you had to actually talk about it. But then getting back to your final question, well, what do I think we can do? Is I think we can actually think about how we're treating churches and religious communities generally. I think about how difficult state and federal laws have made it for religious universities like Yeshiva University to be who they want to be, right? And just keep going. I mean, and even just to start with, setting up these massive public monopolies where people who want to set up small religious schools, these parents have to pay twice. They pay into one tax system to pay for kids not going to school, and then they pay again. Those are ways we're making it very difficult for religious people to pass on their values, because the main way you pass on your values, right, is in the home and in the school. I mean, I don't know, I'm speculating here, but I think if we were we're going to close down the public school system, which is not feasible. But if we did, you could you could imagine an inflection point in birth rates in 18 years. A bunch of babies grow up in these traditional religious community schools. But we'd have to as a country, we'd have to talk about that. I don't think people are ready for that. I don't think people want Like they're not comfortable with the idea that we're going to make it possible for the most religious people out there to sort of have a freer hand in shaping people's values.
Yeah,
but it turns out that one of the most important values religious people contribute is like the belief that having kids is good. Right. So it's in a sense that I think the problem of modern society is that they need to depend upon the things that religious communities offer, but they don't want to sustain religious communities. They want to, right, like take from the religious communities, but not actually set them free, right? They want to box them into these little corners. You can have freedom of worship. Like, wait, what do you mean? You can do your thing. You have coffee and donuts on Sunday, right? But you can't have the schools, right? Oh, I think that's a huge way we think about values transmission being interrupted.
And that's culture too. Like, I mean, we didn't get into feminism, but you do talk about it in your book. But you have like feminist ideas dominate government schools.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
And that's connected to birth, right? Is motherhood valued or not? You have, again, materialist values we've already talked about.
Yeah.
And dominant in schools, because feminism and materialism and all these other kind of essentially like what we call pure bourgeois or like climate, zero-sum game, they're all seen to be neutral positions, right?
Right.
And religious positions are supposed to be, well, that's not a neutral position. But in fact, there's no such thing as a neutral position. Secularism isn't neutral. So that there's like a competition amidst what's the best way to lead a good life and to build a society and have sustainability. And in a sense, the dominant institutions, the secular institutions, have declared one view neutral. That is like, and the other view somehow, private, personal, imposing the view and non-neutral, right? Is that what you think? That's right.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, with like these examples from Gemini and like the other AI examples, right? The ChatGPT examples of like what these, I mean, that's an example of this kind of like non-neutrality, right? It's like, it is, but that's the whole game. And I mean, then the question is like, well, can you create like a neutral or secular like reason to have children that gets people to overcome their, and I kind of doubt that we can. I mean, of course they exist. I mean, I have at least one story in my book of somebody who has a lot of kids for ostensibly non-religious reasons. But I think that's typically going to be the outlier. They're typically going to be the real exception. Because again, we're talking about an activity that's really hard. It takes a lot of self-sacrifice. You have to give up a lot of other things. And you need spiritual resources for that. So that's the crisis of the West that we're in right now, which is like, okay, like, is there some other way to get people to have babies besides essentially sort of participating with them in a celebration of the goodness of God's creation and returning to something like the picture of Genesis at the beginning of the scriptures? Is there any other way we're going to get people to have babies? And I don't know of one. We're not going to get there by like, jiggling with the tax code. Yeah. Even if we should jiggle with the tax code, right? I mean, like, right. That's,
Even if we should, it's not, I think this is why I think your book is so
that's right.
interesting for this reason, is that you're an economist, you're a social philosopher, you're thinking about all these things that's intertwined. And, and I think you're ultimately, you have this line from Angela, when you say children need their mothers, the nation needs its mothers. Policymakers and social scientists who assist them should stop ignoring the role of the spirit and inquiring to where Hannah is. She's in the temple of the Lord of hosts, where she found children and the service of God and what she was seeking, the meaning of her everything. This is the end. For the sake of Hannah's children, who are the future of the nation, set the temple free. And your point there is we need religious freedom. Yeah. But I think this is why one of the things that your book is really interesting, because it goes back to that plausibility structure. Yeah. That ultimately, and I'll give you the last word. So this is, you can tell me if I got this right. But as I've been thinking about this conversation, ultimately, the problem or the issue of children and the birth dearth, which many people don't even know exists, right? And that these women, as a response to that, this is a manifestation of a huge shift that is like has been happening over maybe centuries, but decades especially in our life, that is being good. Our person's good. We're like, it is the manifestation of deep philosophical and anthropological positions that go to the core of religion. And that is,
Yeah.
does God exist? Is the world created good or not?
Mm-hmm.
Is
Mm-hmm.
our persons good or not? Is the body good or not? And that there's this dual thing. If you believe that being is good, matter is good, your body is good, that we're embodied, embedded persons with a purpose and an eternal destiny,
Yeah.
and that we're called to complete creation. If you believe that, you're going to have children. And guess what? If you have a lot of children, you're probably going to start to believe that. And there's this like dialectical relationship of hope and positive vision. And that in one sense, the only way we're going to solve the sustainability problem of the birth dearth is we're going to have people have the vision that being is good and children are good. And the only way you're going to do that is to have people with lots of children.
Have children.
And so I think what your book and your life is, and your work and your study and but also your book is in a sense of the affirmation of the goodness of being. And I use this a lot, so listeners will know, but Joseph Pieper says, to say I love you is to say it is good that you are. It's an affirmation of being. And I think that's in a sense that this birth question, children question, Pharaoh killed children, Herod killed children, and we killed children.
Yeah.
And are children good? The Greeks and the Romans, the Chinese exposed children, as you talk about in your book.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is deepest level of competing of culture of whether being is good and children are good or not. And where this all plays out is in the family. And I think your book is so great because it didn't hit me till right now. So that's why I'm kind of wrestling to articulate this. Yeah. But that's what the book is in a sense about. It's about being and the goodness of being or not.
Yes. And the way for people, for human beings, not for angelic beings or divine beings, the way for human beings,
embedded persons.
Yes. The way for human beings to affirm existence, it comes through the birth of a child, right?
Amen.
So there's that line, which I say something, but I really want to quote Hannah Arendt, who I think is a genius, right? I think the testimonies from the women I talk to, that one way to think about it is they give witness to a different kind of answer to the crisis of the West. Like we've got all these crisis people, like crisis of the West people, and there's lots of different analyses we can provide. Right. It's this or that. But another analysis is not a program or a policy or even like a change of like philosophy, but rather the salvation of the world is in the birth of a child. Like that is actually like the ultimate scandal, right? That the birth of a child, right? And of course, the savior of the world in a sense, that it would be a child. Like it wouldn't be like some big hero. Like it would be this infant, this needy, puking. Like I think that's, I don't know who it was, and I should know this. I should look it up. Who speculated that kind of what caused Lucifer to fall was the thought that he would have to worship a human baby. It's a great idea. It's of course some kind of speculation, but that. Yeah, like we are confronted, and as you say, like Greeks were confronted, and Herod is confronted. Like, our baby's good, and of course, they lead to these other questions: Are people good? Is flesh good? Is the body good? And it's like a reductio kind of argument, right? Like, if all those things are good, like if I'm good in my embodiedness, is the baby still good, right? But if the baby is good, everything else is redeemed in a sense, because it's the hardest case to make, right? This is like a puking, mewing baby, right? People use that phrase. If that's good, then in fact, anybody with more capabilities than a baby is also good. But what we see, right, is this, like the Peter Singer argument. Well, like the chicken is more useful than a baby. So like the chicken gets to live and the baby doesn't get to live. So if you can get the job done, like it's the baby that in a sense redeems our ability to sort of like make sense out of this human existence. So yeah, I do think it's really deep. I really like the way you put it, though. It's not something I've thought a lot about the way that there's a kind of like, the solution is to have children, but to do that, you have to know children are good. And to know that, you have to have children. So this is, I think if I'm being fair to what you said, I think that's what I heard you say. And that reminds me a little bit of this thing that's in the Catholic tradition. And I think it's this idea that lex orandi, lex credendi, right? Like that the law of worship or the law of prayer is the law of belief. I feel like what you just said is actually another way of getting at that how we live in relation to children somehow reinforces beliefs about the goodness of children. And I don't think I can close the loop on on that phrase, lex orandi, lex credendi, and what you said, but I'm going to work on that. So I feel like maybe next time we talk, we should, or you can chew on it too. I think there's something about that. So like, how do you worship as a family, right? What is the essence of the marital sacrament? Like, right, or the marital liturgy, like we sometimes say the domestic church. And the essence of the domestic church is this like marital act by which we can create another person, like we can make a person. So I feel like something about the marital bond, which is the basis of the domestic church, is like the law of prayer or the law of worship for a family. And it probably does lead to a certain type of belief system or belief structure. So maybe I'm getting there. I think those two things are correct. So I'm really grateful that you put it that way, because I think it's like, it feels like a vicious circle. Once you're trapped in it, but you can't get out of it, but by just beginning to pray differently, right? You can't get out of it by beginning to worship the domestic in a different way, right? So yeah, deep stuff. I love it.
Good.
Super interesting.
Yeah. Being is good.
Being is good. I'm 100% with you. And I do think you're right. I think these are really deep and important questions about what it means to be a person.
Yeah, so, good. Well, thank you
thanks.
very much. So great. I mean, it went a long time, super long. This is one of my longest, but it's super interesting. And it's a great book. So I definitely encourage listeners to buy the book. I would love to have you back. We're going to talk about Edith Stein and feminism.
Yeah.
Okay.
Feminism. Good. Let's do it. Yes. Have a date for another month or two. Great.
Wonderful. Thank you,
Thanks
Catherine. And again, the book is Hannah's Children by Professor Catherine Pakaluk. Thank you, Catherine, for being on The Moral Imagination.
You're welcome.